Good afternoon, everyone. This is the September 16th meeting of the Boulder County Planning Commission. We will now come to order. Due to COVID-19 concerns, this meeting is being held virtually. Information on how to participate in the virtual meeting has been posted on the Planning Commission webpage at www.boco.org/P C. There will be an opportunity to remotely provide public comment on the docket listed today on the agenda during the respective virtual public hearing portion for this item. I'll provide instructions about that when we get to each docket. Let's go ahead and take roll call. Commissioner Bloomfield.
Here.
Commissioner Fitch.
Here.
Commissioner Gargano.
Here.
Commissioner Hilton.
Here.
Commissioner Libby.
Here.
Commissioner McMillan.
Here.
Commissioner Niski.
Here.
Commissioner Quigley.
Here.
Great. And obviously I'm here. So we have everyone's here today. That's great. So just a reminder for the planning commissioners, please identify yourself before speaking and speak slowly and clearly. All votes will be roll call votes. Please keep your video on when possible during the hearing and remain on mute until you're ready to speak. When you begin speaking, please identify yourself as planning commissioner. So for example, this is Planning Commissioner Goldfarb. It may help to keep your participant list open in Zoom so you can see who's speaking. The person who's speaking will be bolded. First item on our agenda today is the minutes from our August meeting. Are there any additions or corrections? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve and a second?
Commissioner Bloomfield, I move we approve the minutes from the August meeting.
Is there a second?
Commissioner Fitch, I second that motion.
We'll do a roll call vote. Commissioner Bloomfield.
Aye.
Commissioner Fitch.
Aye.
Commissioner Gargano.
Aye.
Commissioner Hilton.
Aye.
Commissioner Libby.
Aye.
Commissioner McMillan.
Aye.
Commissioner Niski.
Aye.
Commissioner Quigley.
Aye.
Commissioner Goldfarb. Aye. Minutes are approved. Do we have any staff updates today?
Hi, Commissioners. I don't believe we have any staff updates for you today. This is Kim Sanchez. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So our first agenda item today is docket V-20-005, and it's the Boyle vacation. And we have Ryan. Ryan, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name.
Kasaric. It's a tricky
Kasaric.
one. Yep.
Thank you. Ryan Kasaric, planner, who will do a presentation for us. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay, so we should be looking at my screen here now. This is Planning Commission meeting, Ryan Kasaric, planner, community planning and permitting. Here to talk with you this afternoon for V-20-005 Boyle vacation at 7318 Island Circle. This is our vicinity map. So first thing we're looking at here, this is the location of the project. It is to the north and east of city of Boulder, Longmont further along on Diagonal Highway here. The applicants today are Thomas and Ann Boyle. Carl Witten is their agent. Zoning is rural residential. Little history to this parcel. It was platted in 1967. In 1973, a building permit was completed for the construction of a 6,364 square foot residence. We then received SPR 190088 last year that came through with staff here and was approved for the deconstruction of that 6,364 square foot residence, and then a construction of a 6,548 square foot residence. Again, this is in the Island Green subdivision. There's a couple things going on with this after that SPR came through. So first thing is this is on a 0.58 acre parcel. Our assessor actually combines what was historic lot 8 and 9 in the subdivision. During the approval of the SPR, it was discovered that while the building permit in 1973 allowed for the residence to be built across both lots 8 and 9, and in the SPR 190088 more or less followed along the same footprint as that original building permit, the lots, lot 8 and 9, never were merged together. Thus, there's 2 lots with the structure going across those 2 lots. That necessitated the request for an exemption plat, which is actually down here, an additional, what is this? Are you guys seeing my video still? Okay.
Yes.
I just got a
Yes.
pop-up asking me to share my video.
Just to confirm, we're seeing your screen and not your personal video. The screen looks good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm having, it's on the background here. It's muting me and unmuting me, and I'm not doing that, but I think we're good here now. So there's an exemption plat that came in, or that we then required to merge lot 8 and 9, which historically had been together but needed to be formally done in order to for the residence at SPR 190088 approved to be built. During the time that came through, we realized there was a platted utility easement that needed to be moved to allow for the house to be built, and also to allow for the drainage associated with the house to really be done correctly. Thus, we're here for V-20-0005, which is the request to vacate the platted utility easement and relocate the easement to allow for the construction of the new residence approved by SPR 190088. So here is the regional, this is the residence, the parcel we're looking at. Zooming further in, this was the old residence, the one approved in 1973. You can see the drainage area that we're talking about. Just to kind of do a run through here of the existing, the conditions. This is geohazard. The SPR, then the approval of the site plan review specifies conditions associated with this. None of those conditions are associated with this vacation or exemption plat. No public lands really nearby. Nothing from our comprehensive plan layers either for the parcel. So this is a little existing condition run through as well. This is how it was originally platted. You can see lot line running right through where the house was located at. You can also see that platted utility easement that we're looking to vacate and relocate today. So SPR came in and approved this residence, more or less the same location, fairly close to being the same size as previous, but necessitating the 2 dockets that kind of came after it. First one being EP 20-0003, which we found could be approved administratively to remove this lot line between these 2 lots to merge the lots together. However, in the process of doing that, came to our attention that this utility easement, this easement that's platted right here, needs to be vacated in order for that home approved through SPR 190088 to be built and for all the drainage to work. So the request today is to vacate this easement, relocate it to here to allow for the development of the parcel to happen. So this is kind of the grand scheme of everything. The new house gets built, the lot line goes away. The easement that's located roughly here is vacated and placed over here, relocated to this spot. So a couple site photos. Here's that drainage area, the easement getting moved from sort of this location to over here in this open field, looking at it more there. And then just kind of further zoom in, you can see that it was being used for drainage. The intent of the new vacation is to do that as well. This is kind of from the front yard, basically just scooting the easement a little bit further over that way. We received referrals from a number of agencies, most having no concerns or no response. Boulder County Development Review Team, Engineering, said that vacating and relocating of the existing easement is supportable and is consistent with the location of the drainage improvements approved through SPR 190088. The Boulder County Surveyor requested that on the new plat, there be a sign-off spot for the vacation of the easement on the plat. Excel Energy had included within their referral for this vacation information more on just wanting to get verification for that the natural gas line leading to the residence deconstructed has been properly retired. That'll be handled through the building permit for the residents. No public comments were received, and again, like I said, a number of no concerns or responses. Look at the vacation criteria, 10-100A. Public roads and alleys and easements may be vacated after consideration at a public hearing by both the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners. This is the Planning Commission hearing for this. Board of County Commissioners hearing will be scheduled later. 10-100B, unless otherwise noted, portions of the road or alley be vacated down the center line. This is not applicable. We're not vacating a road or alleyway. 10-100C, application and processing requirements are included in Article 3. The application requirements were met. Processing following approval or conditional approval of vacation, the applicant shall submit to the Land Use Department all necessary documents. The applicant must provide a new deed, associated legal description to community planning and permitting staff for the review and approval and recordation of the new plat. And then 10-100E, the vacation becomes effective upon recordation of the board's resolution of approval with the Boulder County Clerk and Recorder's Office. And this is just, prior to recordation, the applicant must comply with and complete all conditions of approval. Land use, which I should say community planning and permitting department staff shall record the commissioner's resolution of approval with the Clerk and Recorder's Office within a year of the commissioner's approval. So with that all said, recommendation is from community planning and permitting staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend a conditional approval for the docket V-20-0005 Boyle vacation, subject to 3 conditions listed in the staff recommendation. Those being the platted easement shown in the application materials vacated, established in the location shown in Figure 2 of the staff recommendation. We looked at it in this presentation as well. And then the applicant shall meet all the post-approval requirements within 1 year after the date of the Board of County Commissioners resolution approving this vacation. Resolution associated documents shall also be recorded by community planning and permitting staff with the county clerk and recorders within this 1 year time frame. This vacation approval should not be considered final or effective until this recordation. Finally, this vacation approval shall expire if recognition does not occur within the 1 year time frame unless an extension is granted. So the applicant shall be subject to the terms and conditions and commitments of record in the file for docket V-20-0005 Boyle vacation. That's everything I got for this one.
Thank you. Any questions at this time, commissioners? Or comments?
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm hearing that, things are just sort of moving slow. So, but the conditions will be, you think a year is plenty of time. This is Commissioner Gargano, by the way, sorry. Just checking the year.
Yes, so I kind of caught a little bit of your question there, so I apologize if I don't get everything right, but the conditions here that we have listed here for the vacation, which is sort of the first step that needs to happen, that needs to occur within the year. There's been a building permit turned in already for the residents, which went through site plan review last year.
Okay.
That has a number of conditions that we see for typical site plan reviews, that a building permit be applied for, grading permits, that material samples and things like that are handed in. So this vacation doesn't have any of those conditions with it, but I think
I was just trying to tell, can they, is it tied to that other stuff, and are those things going to be slower? But it sounds like not really.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Other questions?
Commissioner McMillan, I have a question. There's a concrete swale that's under the existing drainage easement. At least I think there is. Does that get removed, or does it move to the new drainage easement, or How do you make sure that, I guess, drainage isn't still going down that swale?
Yeah, so that it is getting removed, just like how the easement needs to be taken away in order for it to get removed. But it's getting removed and placed in a different spot, or really a new swale is getting built in a different location that'll better facilitate drainage for the parcel, or for the parcel and the residents. The drainage and the review of that happens and is associated with that site plan review that was approved last year. So this is sort of kind of coming through the review of that, where it was realized that that easement needed to be moved for a couple of reasons. One, the house was built in the area of the easement, and then to really facilitate drainage in a positive way, the easement itself just needed to be moved in the structure within it. So a new drainage structure will be built.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Anything else for Ryan at this time? Okay. If there are no further questions for Ryan, then I would invite the applicant at this time to make a presentation. And if you could please state your name and address before you begin.
Yes, my name is Thomas Boyle, and do you want my current address or the address that we're trying to move to?
Your current address, please.
Okay, the current address is 3639 21st Street in Boulder, 80305. I don't have a presentation by any means. Carl Witten, I believe, is also on this call, and he has a lot more experience with this than I do. This is the first time we've ever taken on a project like this. So this is all new to me, and I don't understand the process, nor do I pretend to. I think the biggest thing that I would just like to communicate is that we've been patient. We will continue to be patient. We want to respect the process and the order that things need to happen. Just with the timing of things, you know, the current house that we have in the site plan review, I think, is 4 feet into the old easement. And we've run out of summer. Obviously, we're beginning the fall here. We would really like to at least get the foundation built and in, you know, before the snow flies, if that's possible. If it's not, it's not. But I don't, when it says a year to get the easement vacated, and we started this process, you know, almost 9 months ago, I just, is there any way that could happen? And if the answer is no, the answer is no, but we would just like to at least get moving on the project, you know, as soon as we can. And Carl, I don't know if I articulated that well, or if you know, again, you've got more experience in this than I do, but you may have some comments as well.
Thank you. Carl Witten, do you have any comments? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, yes. I just wanted to follow up and say, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you please state your name and your address for the record, please?
Absolutely. Carl Witten, Witten Design Group, 183 Taylor, Louisville. I just wanted to thank you for your time and your consideration, and thanks to Ryan and Jennifer Severson for their work on this. I know it's been a long, drawn-out affair. I think Ryan covered all of the modifications that are being requested, but let me know if there are any other questions.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for the applicant at this point, commissioners? Sam, are you, I can't tell if you're speaking. You're muted.
I don't have a question.
Okay, all right, thanks. It's kind of hard to see sometimes. All right, so no questions for the applicant at this point. And as I understand it, we have no one signed up for public comment. Is that still correct?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So I will open for public hearing, and if there's anyone who has not signed up to comment, someone from the public, but would like to, you have an opportunity to do so at this time. And it seems that we don't have anyone who hasn't signed up who would like to comment. So we'll go ahead and move on then. Discussion by commissioners or any further questions for anyone?
As Commissioner Bloomfield, it seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Neske. My main concern would have been to make sure that the drainage on the property was adequately addressed, and it doesn't seem to be that there's any concerns from the engineer, and staff supports the decision. So I feel comfortable moving forward with the vacation.
Anything from anyone else?
This is Commissioner Libby. Unfortunately, this didn't get caught earlier. I appreciate that people are trying to get things moved along. I don't see any other reason to discuss it too much further. I had one quick question for staff. And just in looking at the site plan, there is a utility easement along the south and eastern edge of the property. I'm assuming we're okay with that easement as well, now that we're doing it this time. That's been checked for location as well.
Yeah, that one is okay.
Okay. Yeah, then I think we should move ahead.
Okay. All right. Would anyone care to make a motion at this point?
I'll make a motion. This is Commissioner McMillan. I move that the Planning Commission recommend that the Board of County Commissioners conditionally approve docket V20-0005, the Boyle vacation with the 3 conditions outlined in the staff report.
This is Commissioner Gargano, and I'll second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, let's do a roll call vote then. Commissioner Bloomfield? Commissioner Fitch?
Aye.
Commissioner Gargano?
Aye.
Commissioner Hilton?
Aye.
Commissioner Libby?
Aye.
Commissioner McMillan?
Aye.
Commissioner Neske?
Aye.
Commissioner Quigley?
Aye.
And Commissioner Goldfarb votes aye. So the Boyle vacation passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations.
Thank you.
All right. The next item that we have on our docket today is a discussion, and we have a number of staff members who are participating. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
So whenever you are ready, this is a discussion on racial equity and inclusion by the Community Planning and Zoning. And this is discussion session number 1.
Sure. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Dale Case, Director of the Community Planning and Permitting Department. Appreciate you allowing us to have this time to have this discussion today. This is session 1. We call it session 1 because we hope to build on the conversation and continue to move forward on centering planning and programming efforts on race. To start the conversation, we think it is important to have an understanding of our past. Understanding the implications of past decisions will help us build a more inclusive and complete community as we plan Boulder County. For this agenda item, I will give a quick overview of the planner's role and the county's commitment to inclusion. Then the team, which has worked really hard over the last few months, several months, to put this together. So I appreciate all the work, and I think it's going to make for a rich discussion. The team will provide a historic context to planning and development in the county. We acknowledge the topic can be difficult and sometimes uncomfortable. The county's experience and how systemic racism has impacted our development pattern and equitable opportunities for all is not unique. Discriminatory practices are unfortunately woven throughout the history of U.S. development. As staff has taken the time to discuss this topic, it has been interesting to hear and understand the different perspectives and experiences staff brings to the table. And we hope to hear from you and the community in an open dialogue as this program unfolds. Your ideas, questions, perspectives on the subject will make for a richer process. This presentation is not an indictment of all our planning decisions. There are many positive outcomes to acknowledge to our stewardship and environmental protections. They help protect the public health, lower infrastructure costs, and make transit and redevelopment options possible by promoting compact communities. There will be opportunities through the presentation for you to reflect and ask questions, and we hope a discussion at the end to help direct us on topics or items that you would like to explore for future discussions. We are also interested in ideas for actions that we can take to further embed racial equity in our operations. So if we can go to the next slide, Angel. Okay, thank you. So just a little on planning history, and I'm going to try and keep this very brief because I could geek out and go into this for hours. There are many different theories circulating about how we plan our communities. Equity and advocacy are not new concepts. Advocacy and equity planning go back over 60 years with Paul Davidoff on advocacy planning and Norm Krumholtz on equity planning. I was fortunate to have Norm as a professor in grad school at Cleveland State University. His class was very different than the others. We learned and discussed a planner's role in the community. The role as an advocate as opposed to a technocrat, a voice for those who might not have a seat at the table. This class and Norm were a building block for me and so many other planners. The quotes that's on the slide regarding the jitney is something that has stuck with me, as he brought it up often throughout the class as an example of racial inequities and how money gets spent. The dollars that go towards highways and projects to serve the suburbs as a glaring inequity. Instead of looking at the solutions of getting people to jobs, medical appointments, and groceries that are most needed, helping to develop a dynamic transportation system that could adjust to changing circumstances would serve those most in need. Why is it so hard? We often say a planner's role and our role appears to balance competing interests. I think that's what we try to do, but I think what this presentation helps illuminate is there can't be balance when the competition isn't fair. The balance is skewed so that certain groups have access and certain groups have not benefited from the efforts. In addition, a discussion around balance generally assumes a this or that outcome. We know issues are much more complex with many inputs and potential outcomes. Our job is to recognize this and act on this disparity. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is the planner's role? What's on the screen there is the American Institute of Certified Planners Code of Ethics. And you'll see after many of our names that certification, and that's our professional planning certification. And part of that code of ethics that we must follow is Section A, which are things that we aspire to. And if you can click on this, Angel, and make the highlighted parts come through, that's great. And this really gets to the point of engagement and what our role is as a planner in the community. You can see the bolded sections there. It gets to the point of people having the opportunity to have meaningful impact and have a responsibility, and our responsibility as planners to include those that don't have formal organization or influence. Again, something I had talked about a lot through my grad school and getting my degree in planning. Section F, you know, again, remember these are aspirational goals, but when you look at the wording, it's very exacting. It's, we shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs. So again, a planner's role is an active role. It is not sitting behind a desk being a technocrat. Our job, our role, our aspirational duties is to push these issues forward and to work to try to make sure all the communities are heard within Boulder County. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in Boulder County? A lot of efforts ongoing to try to address these pieces. The county has adopted strategic priorities, the county commissioners. There are 5 priority areas to help provide leadership and direction to county operations. They were developed using community input and feedback from the Boulder County Comp Plan, the Regional Affordable Housing Plan, Public Health Improvement Process, the Transportation Master Plan, Parks and Open Space Vision 2020, the Sustainability Plan, and others. The priorities help us focus the organization. If you review the document, you will see equity as a key principle underlying the implementation of each of the 5 priority areas. Then you note the priority areas of affordable living, climate action, and equity and justice as 3 of those, with specific goals and objectives. This equity work that we're doing here and the equity work we're doing around the county aligns with the strategic priorities. Next slide, please. These are the 5 strategic priorities that the commissioners have adopted. And we will provide you a link of reference materials to all this with a bunch of links to this. We're just trying to finalize all this still today. So we'll get that to you later today. Next slide, please. So from a planning perspective in the county comprehensive plan addresses equity in our guiding principles. The bolded out guiding principles really help shine the light on areas of equity within our comp plan. But our comprehensive plan and our land use code are opportunities to help evolve policies to move forward on racial equity. These conversations will help us figure out how to move forward. A few examples where you can go look at some comprehensive plans and policy areas that do more at advancing racial equity are Seattle, Portland, and Montgomery County, Maryland. Montgomery County, Maryland uses a racial equity lens, which the county is looking at and using in other places that Kathy will talk about a little bit as they review each projects under their master plan. So every project that comes through, their staff looks at it through an equity lens. And so those are things that we can try to advance and move forward. Planning has positive outcomes. The preservation of environmental resources, including habitat, ag land for local food, more compact urban and suburban development. Compact urban development lessens infrastructure costs and helps make transit possible. But as we note, additional focus is necessary. We need to look to inclusionary zoning requirements and building programs to help meet the community's housing needs. How do we get past the common refrain that we hear at public hearings of, I fully support affordable housing, but this just isn't the right location? We also commonly hear we can't build our way out of this. That's true, but we should also be hearing we cannot not build ourselves out of this. The solutions are complex and multi-layered. We need to build more housing. And we know that just building more housing is not a solution unto itself, but building more with supporting inclusionary policies and recognizing all the costs associated with living, transportation, health, environmental, family time, etc., are all things that must be looked at through that lens as we consider the future of Boulder County. The regional housing plan and community's efforts to achieve a 12% affordable goal is very promising. Our communities have all committed to helping achieve this goal. Boulder and Longmont with inclusionary zoning requirements already. Superior considered an ordinance last night. Erie staff has been directed in preparing one as well. New county housing authority projects in Nederland, Longmont, Louisville, and Lafayette are helping to address that need. And there's so much more that we can do. Overcoming the disparities resulting from the actions is not easy, and we appreciate your efforts as we tackle these issues. With that, we are going to show a brief video, and then Kathy Sandoval will give some further background on the development and some of the county's internal efforts to overcome discrimination. And Kathy's really involved in our department in working on a bunch on internal committees to help further racial equity within the organization and outside the organization. Thanks.
When you share your screen, you have to pick to choose to share computer audio in that sharing dialog for the audio to come through.
Yeah, we're not hearing anything.
Great, thank you. I'll reshare. Sorry about that. Not as familiar with Teams. Okay, let's try that one more time.
Angel.
Okay, I think this should work.
Okay.
Wave at me if it doesn't, that way, because I can hear it, but I can't hear you guys.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters, warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit, struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
All right. Oops. We could go. Thank you, Angel. This is Kathy Sandoval, staff planner for community planning and permitting. Good afternoon, planning commissioners. Well, we shared this video with you as a jumping off point for our discussion today. In Boulder County, race matters. Race is centered in our equity and justice strategic priority because race is the biggest predictor of disproportionate outcomes and disparities in the United States. As the video highlighted, and additionally, as a government organization, it's our moral responsibility to interrupt institutional racism, which manifests through racial laws, policies, and practices, some of which were outlined in that video. To advance racial equity, a conversation about race and the application of racial equity tools for Boulder County, the county has been striving to normalize this conversation. And as part of our strategic priority on equity and justice, goal number 1 is to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion at Boulder County by implementing Boulder County's Culturally Responsive Inclusion Roadmap, which was adopted in 2016 by the Board of County Commissioners. I was part of that committee that helped create that roadmap. It's part of what we call the Cultural Responsive Inclusionary Advisory Committee. It's an employee-based committee that works on racial equity issues. And as we go through our slides, I'm going to invite you to reflect on the information we are sharing with you. And reflect, take notes as we're going through this conversation. We have some questions we want you to consider, and we'll pause from time to time to have and share with you some reflections and hear your reflections on it. And as you come into this conversation about racial equity in planning and zoning, you may be coming from many different perspectives and feelings and believings, or perhaps thinking about these issues or wanting to take actions. And many of you may have all these reflections all at once. We just ask that as we do racial equity work in Boulder County, we've been involved with several racial equity trainings, and a useful tool that we use from the Pacific Education Group on Courageous Conversation about Race is I ask you to consider these 4 agreements as we go through this presentation. Stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and expect and accept non-closure. So in that spirit of this video that we just saw, let's take a further look into the house we live in. The slide here, we acknowledge as staff, and I identify as a brown Chicana. She, hers, ella, and along with my colleagues, we want to acknowledge that Boulder County is on the land within the territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people. We acknowledge the institution we represent was founded upon the exclusion and attempted erasure of indigenous peoples and cultures. And we acknowledge the American Indian community in Boulder County today, elders of the past, present, and future generations. Next slide, please. So to acknowledge the lands on which we are on, we must also acknowledge that the US was not on a land that was vacant. As this map illustrates, the patterns of tribal territories prior to colonial development was comprehensive and covered the entire nation. This was not vacant land, and it is important to uncover this untold story. Next slide. In uncovering this untold story, we also must acknowledge the framework on which this nation was founded. Under the doctrine of discovery, taking you back to perhaps your school days, this concept where lands could be claimed to colonial powers, since colonial powers did not recognize the inhabitants of this land and were not subjects of a European Christian monarch. In other words, this doctrine is used to support decisions to invalidate or ignore the lands of indigenous people in America and favor the conquest of colonial development. Further, it was established with a Supreme Court decision by Chief Justice John Mitchell and explained and applied the ways colonial powers laid claim to indigenous lands. This doctrine is institutionalized in acquisitions of lands that now make up Boulder County. And as this poster illustrates, Indian land was offered for sale and available in Colorado. Next slide, please. As the doctrine of discovery moved westward, and as earlier maps of the US illustrate, the map on the left is an 1834 map. And you can kind of define sort of the area. You can see that Boulder County at that time was considered Indian country. By 1949, the area is proclaimed as unorganized territory. So within that short period of time, things had changed quite a bit. Next slide, please. So how was this institutionalized? How did this play out? By creating federal and Indian law, the Federal and Indian Law Compact created a body of US laws that creates treaties, statutes, executive orders, court cases that define that only the federal government has a relationship with tribes. And the role of the tribes and state is under federal jurisdiction. As this relates to Boulder County, the treaties that are in this area of Fort Wise and Fort Laramie helped to create the reservations for the Arapaho and Cheyenne on the Upper Arkansas. and revised their claims to include the Arkansas River and Sand Creek. And this became certainly the precursor of the Sand Creek massacre. Boulder County area is still considered unceded land by the Arapaho and Cheyenne. Next slide, please. So again, how is this institutionalized? So by creating that federal and Indian law compact, it certainly created these different laws that we're working by. And it created it through these different acts. So we can see here, we have the Homestead Act, we have Surplus Lands Act, and often they were directed towards specific tribes to take over Indian lands. And in reality, they became the foundations of settlers' community. As you can see from the bottom slide, some of the settler community that we celebrate through the Boulder County Agricultural Heritage Center. Next slide, please. So as part of this history, we see that federal law created the U.S. Rectangular Survey System. You might be familiar with it and have seen it throughout your different mapping inquiries. This describes how lands are described by metes and bounds descriptions, which was a tradition created in Europe and came to the United States. This simple standard system sped up settlement and reduced disputes and bloodshed from boundary descriptions. Next slide, please. In this slide, we can see how Boulder County has adopted this mapping system. This is, you may have seen this many times. It's from our GIS mapping program that shows the incorporated towns of Boulder County, but also shows in the light gray lines, the section, townships, and range that reflect this rectangular survey system. Next slide, please. Certainly with the discovery of gold and other valuable minerals, the county has changed forever as the federal government issued government lots, patents, homestead lots, and the Arapaho, Utes, and Cheyenne people are pushed out on unceded land, and private properties are established in Boulder County. Next slide, please. This slide here kind of gives you a summary of that history. Again, we want to circle back to this untold story because we often don't hear it in our school books, but it is still just as real and valid reality that is our history. And it's part of Boulder County, from the early settlements and distribution of where Utes and Lakotas and Arapahos and Cheyenne tribes would go, from the influx of Spanish speakers from New Mexico and the colonizations that were done, to treaties that were commenced with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Larimer Treaty, and others, to the removal of Native Americans from different areas of Colorado, to certainly the final sort of conflicts of the Sand Creek massacre between the Arapaho and Cheyenne, and having reservations in the southwest of the state, to finally moving forward with where we are getting closer to today. With that, I wanted to turn my slides over to Alberto de los Rios to continue on.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Alberto de los Rios. I am a planner one in community planning and permitting. My pronouns are he, him, his. And after the Native American heritage that existed way beyond any discovery from the West, we also have the rich cultural heritage from Latin Americans, primarily coming from Mexico. So after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the 1840s, several of the people that already lived in the former Mexican border were allowed to stay in the newly US border, but were given the privileges of attaining US citizenship. And in the census, they were also considered to be white. However, this treatment based on the color of their skin and their heritage was different in practice. There were two considerable waves of migration into Boulder County, primarily coming from central Mexico, and then coming from northern New Mexico, but also in the state of New Mexico within the US country. The two major reasons for why many Mexicans and New Mexicans came to Boulder County and the state of Colorado in general was for mining and agricultural practices. And as we see here in these two maps provided by the Boulder County Latino History Project, we have many of the first waves of immigrants came from Durango, Zacatecas, Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacan, which are central regions within Mexico. And most of them traveled through the center of Mexico all the way to El Paso and then in New Mexico. And if you see on the picture on the right, there were several migration patterns within the United States that depict some of the travels that many families and young agricultural and mining workers did over the years, primarily doing seasonal mining and agricultural work, but most of them ended up in Boulder County. Next slide, please. So in the history of Boulder County, some of the still major three towns that we have continue to tell a larger story for the Latinos. So in the case of Boulder, it has always been considered the major business center of the county, for it holds the county seat and also has the research center known as the University of Colorado. Among the three towns, this had the smallest Latino population, and it was primarily concentrated between University Hill and downtown. And for Latinos, it was really difficult to interact with the outside world and the rest of the economy, for they were physically and socially spaced out. And they experienced strong racism and elitism from the people of Boulder until the 1960s, when the civil rights movement effected change and changed consciousness of the general public. For Longmont, it was a food processing and agricultural site, and it focused primarily on a large sugar beet production. And by the 1930s, the majority of the sugar beet workers that were on the fields were Mexicans or New Mexicans. And even though that the thriving population of Latinos lived in Longmont, there was still overt racism and segregation until the 1950s. Among some of the examples that Mexicans and New Mexicans experienced for racism was segregated spaces such as movie theaters in which they were not allowed to go and only whites could attend. Lastly, we have the town of Lafayette, where coal mining was the primary operation. And with this also came a more laid back, a smaller fashion type of town, where among the three towns, it had the least amount of segregation. In fact, there were several integrated unions where both whites and Latinos worked together for a common goal. And there was a sense of camaraderie, small businesses, and humility among everybody, as told by anecdotes of people that lived in Lafayette. Next slide, please. Another example that is not directly located in Boulder County, but is very close in Gilpin County, is Lincoln Hills. Lincoln Hills is the only resort and vacation site in the outdoors for African Americans west of the Mississippi River. And it was a very significant landmark for African Americans to go vacation and to leave the city, for it was only 1 hour drive away from the city of Denver. Especially in the beginning of the 1920s, when the KKK populated and took over all of the city of Denver, both politically and socially, African Americans felt a lot of pressure to find ways to escape and to be in touch with the outdoors. So Lincoln Hills was created. And it was very popular until the 1960s because it was the only set in which they could attend and they could visit. But after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, they were then allowed to expand their horizons and visit other places. A lot of these people were able to own homes, but they ended up just using them as campsites because of the Great Depression of the 1930s. But even now, it serves as a cultural heritage site, and it still teaches a lot of people of the importance of African Americans being in the outdoors. Next slide, please. And I will pass back to Kathy Sandoval.
Unmute here. So this is another example of some of the county that you may or may not be aware of. It's in contrast to the community of Lincoln Hills, but it's actually located pretty physically close to Lincoln Hills up Coal Creek Canyon along the areas of the old Carter Lake and the Indian Roads. The top picture is one of the original sort of cabins and areas where they sold the different lots. Below is the original sort of platted area that was submitted to our code recorder. There was an historical survey that was prepared by Histor Architecture about Wondervu, and it noted that Wondervu was established by a Denver attorney named Otto Frederick, and Wondervu was meant to be like a mountain retreat for the working class. The area was accessible by rail and a roadway from Denver to Sulphur Springs. Perhaps the most notable aspect, though, about Otto's development is the strict covenants regulations that were in place on each property. Buyers were legally bound to exclude non-whites from the use of their Wondervu properties. Violation of this covenants carried a severe penalty. The offending property owner would forfeit his or her Wondervu real estate back to Otto or his agents without any compensation. So this kind of gives us another sort of juxtaposition of another town site that was developed in Boulder County. Next slide, please. So now we want to hear back from our Planning Commission. We're just going to take a little 10-15 minute pause break here. And I want you to sort of ponder these questions. So when we examine the history of land use development, the comprehensive plan does not acknowledge this history. And we'd like to hear from your reflections of how we can establish a closer alignment with the strategic priority of equity and justice. Would anyone like to, offer some reflections on that?
I'll start out. This is Commissioner Goldfarb. I think that what I think about initially is to try to bring more people from different backgrounds, different racial groups into the discussion and decision-making processes that we have, formal and informal, in the county.
Yeah.
And as to how we do that, I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking, this is Commissioner Gargano, are there, when we think about our referral agencies, right, are there groups that we should be connecting with that we aren't currently, that maybe give some of those voices, seats on these boards that are designated for the people who originally held this land before we took it, right? Things like that would be really interesting to explore. And adding it to the comprehensive plan in some way, the way that the staff have brought it into their, joint statements and purpose. Those are just my initial thoughts.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Commissioner Bloomfield. I think what speaks most loudly to me is just the notion of sort of who has a voice and who I don't know who we listen to. I don't know if that's exactly the right phrasing, but certainly when I think about who, as we're reviewing things, we hear from a lot of landowners, and those are the people that are advantaged by the inequity that we've seen for a couple of centuries. And so I think the question for me is, how do we actually bring in the voices, similar to what the other commissioners have said, but how do we bring in the voices of those people who are not involved in the process as much because they're not landowners? And yeah, again, I'm not sure exactly how to do that, but it feels like that would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Neske. This actually reminds me of the Boulder County Pearl program, which is actually how I got to be on the Planning Commission. It's the People Engaged in Raising Leaders, and it's available to any Boulder County resident, but it focuses on getting low income and minorities the training and the background they need to apply for and get the education or the information available to the boards that are available in Boulder County. So if it sort of teaches you about Robert's Rules of Order and the different boards and commissions that are available. And in going through that class, I got to meet a lot of different people in the area, and it really broadened my horizons on the opportunities and the resources available. So that's one program that I think has really has sort of reminded me during this presentation of how important that is to get all different voices to the table. And I know that that was a question that was asked when we were interviewed for the Planning Commission is, what is the most important aspect of it? And it's making sure that everybody has a voice and has the opportunity to express their opinion. And so I think it's, if there's a way that we can get more people involved and maybe, the ability to do more Zoom and online resources to get more people involved and get the information that they need would be another way to start. But the PRO program kind of highlights that for me, if we could get more people involved that way.
This is Commissioner Goldfarb. I'm curious, how many people out of that program ended up on boards, and were some of those people from minority groups?
That's a good question. I believe Robin keeps track of the graduates from the PRO program and sort of how they progress forward. I'm not sure. I'm Hispanic and I made it on a board, so that's one.
Yeah.
We can try and get you that information. That's good.
Okay, that would be interesting.
Some of those metrics, yeah.
Thanks.
Anyone else have any comments? Reflections?
Just one of the other reflections I've had is, this is Commissioner Gargano, especially when we have very heated discussions and docket items with a lot of the public present. That public tends to be that the people who have time to leave work in the middle of the day and can come downtown, or can leave work to get on a call, right? Or know how to use Zoom and use it on the regular and have a good enough internet connection to do so. I've been thinking about that a lot. I still come back to that, are there other referral groups maybe so that we can give them equal weight? But I don't know. I just have always felt over the years of doing this that we tend to only get one side of most docket items, especially when they're heated. So I don't have a solution there, but it's definitely something that's bothered me for some time.
Sounds like a continuing conversation to keep having and start looking at further. You bet. Anyone else?
Maybe if I can just interject, we are looking at a solution for public hearings, which would change how we do them. The city of Lakewood has been utilizing it for a couple of years now, and it would help us not have a hearing just in the afternoon. It actually would be posting staff reports and presentations and applicant presentations a week before, and taking comments basically online through the platform through that time, and then Planning Commission would meet and consider all those comments over the course of the week. So people who have families, people who have jobs that can't get away in the middle of the afternoon or in the evenings for things, would have that ability to have input into the system. And we would look at combining that with some of the cultural broker programs the county has to try to reach out to some of the other groups too, to try to help people be more involved. So I think there's all sorts of good things, and those are great ideas, Leishan, that we want to open up, and so there's better participation.
Yeah, and Commissioner Gargano, one more time. I was just thinking too, would that all be bilingual as well? And would we be able to take comments in Spanish, or maybe we already do and I just don't notice because you translate them for us already?
We are working to do all that now,
Okay.
yes, and moving in that direction. We have bilingual pay program now with the county, and so we have the ability, more ability than we've had in the past, but it's still a shortcoming, I think, that we need to keep working on.
Dale, this is Commissioner Goldfarb. How would that differ from what is currently being done? Because currently we get written comments from people prior to the meetings. So I think I'm not understanding what would be different.
Yeah. So it opens up the public hearing, and so staff's able to answer questions. The applicants are able to answer questions in that intervening period too, so that things don't hang there for a week and everything gets answered at the hearing.
Got it.
There is more interactivity over the course of that week, so it's like a week-long public hearing basically. And
okay.
I don't want to go into details on that because we got a lot more to get through here, but what the City of Lakewood's found is it has increased the number of younger participants, folks with families and that sort of demographic. And so that's awesome, and that's something we'd want to do to get more input. And I think, again, if we can work and combine it with the Cultural Brokers Program and some other outreach efforts, we could really utilize something like that to move things forward for participation.
Got it.
This is Commissioner Bloomfield. So the specific question of acknowledging the history of land use development, and like I'm wondering if there's a way of having just a more comprehensive resource. Like, I live up Sunshine Canyon. As I'm listening to this, I'm like, oh right, I bet you there were Native Americans that lived on my property. And like having some kind of resource where I would be able to actually explore that, I think would be really valuable in terms of the education piece and the just awareness. And so I don't know if there's a way of having some sort of map overlay where there's a little bit more history. But I also think that maybe incorporating into the comprehensive plan, like what is actually the history of Native tribes in the area, and with specifics of the different canyons, and if that's available.
Yeah. Interesting things to contemplate, and certainly some of those resources we probably do have, and we just need to be more purposeful in maybe having that exposure. Well, I want to thank you for your reflections and questions that you had and suggestions. We do have quite a bit more to continue on. On the second part of this question, just kind of want to keep that in mind as we go through this whole slideshow, and we'll get a little bit more to that at the end. And with that, I just want to turn it over to the next presenter.
Hi, everyone. Jasmine Rodenburg with Boulder County Community Planning and Permitting. So I am going to talk to you about bias in zoning and regulatory practices. And I have a pretty short amount of time to do this, but this topic really deserves a lot more attention, and you can dive quite deep into this. I got a lot of my information from a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And so if people are interested in diving in a bit more, that's one resource that I found helpful, but there are many others out there. So let's dive in. So this segregation is something that we need to consider both in past practices and current practices in planning and zoning. But I do want to start by saying after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, we didn't kind of just go straight from that into segregation. There was a short period of time where as part of Reconstruction following the Civil War, there were many communities that were actually integrated communities. So multiple races and groups lived together. And it was in the early 1900s, following kind of a backlash from the Reconstruction era, that we really got into seeing more segregation on an explicit planning and zoning level. And so it's important to acknowledge that history. So starting in the early 1900s, there were really explicit segregation ordinances that were signed off by different mayors. And I have one example here from the mayor of a town in Baltimore. And it basically prohibited Black residents from buying homes on blocks where white residents were a majority and vice versa. And the goal was to really truly have, you know, different areas within a town or even states where Black residents lived and white residents lived, and there was an emphasis on no integration. Next slide, please. Then comes a Supreme Court case, Buchanan v. Worley in 1917. And this was one of the earlier cases that directly addressed the question of whether or not segregation ordinances, like the ones I talked about earlier, violated the Constitution. And in this case, there was a white individual who sold a house to a Black individual in Louisville, Kentucky, but it was on a block where a majority of the residents were white. And so that violated the local segregation ordinance. In this case, the Supreme Court said that yes, that did violate the Constitution, though I think kind of an interesting nuance to that decision is that it really focused on property rights and the freedom to contract. So the ability for that white individual to sell to whoever he wanted to, rather than focusing the decision on equality of the freed slaves. And so I think that that was kind of an interesting and important distinction in this case. Yeah, next slide, please. So after the Supreme Court basically said, no, you can't have these segregation ordinances that explicitly state, you know, you can't have different groups of people living in the same block, people got creative and tried to find ways to come up with the same outcome, but without having explicit segregation ordinances. And so that's kind of where some zoning got its, and planning got its origins. So exclusionary zoning is zoning where it has the effect on excluding certain people, and it's usually based on race and class. And in the early 1900s, zoning and planning was not as prominent as it is today. So not every municipality had different planning groups and planning maps and processes and things like that. It was kind of a novel topic and a novel thing to do. Then in comes the Hoover administration. And he created the Advisory Committee on Zoning, which created a model zoning law. And the members of the committee, the Advisory Committee on Zoning, were well-known segregationists, and Hoover was trying to set up this committee and model zoning laws to have an effect of segregating communities, but without doing so through overt segregation ordinances, which were now not allowed per the Supreme Court decision. And some of the comments that came from these members on the committee is that planning is necessary to maintain the nation and the race. And in any housing developments which are to succeed, racial divisions have to be taken into account. And so it's really clear that even though zoning kind of was a way to get around of the segregation ordinances by, you know, promoting planning in smart ways and to benefit the community and things like that, really the origins and the underlying desire to have zoning across America was to continue racial segregation. And so on the right-hand side here, I kind of have the model zoning law, and it starts out like many even modern day zoning ordinances start out, which it's for the purpose of promoting health, safety, morals, or the general welfare of the community. The legislative body of cities and incorporated villages are empowered to regulate and restrict, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you go further down in this model ordinance, regulate and restrict is further defined as sufficiently all-embracing. Nothing will be gained by adding the terms as exclude, segregate, limit, and determine. So it's pretty clear that the origins of zoning and the early model zoning laws were meant to allow communities to segregate without having explicit segregation ordinances. Next slide. And you kind of have to click because thanks, yeah. And then one more time. So one of the biggest tools of exclusionary zoning is redlining, which was covered a little bit in the video that everyone watched, but the map on the right here is of Denver. And so it's the redlining map of Denver where there's the red districts, and those are considered the lowest grade or the 4th grade districts. Blue and yellow are the intermediate grades, and then green is considered the like good grade, like the good districts, so to speak. These maps are really important because when the Federal Housing Administration came around in 1934, they would not insure mortgage loans to Black individuals or white individuals looking to move near a Black majority community. And so how did they know this? Well, there were these different redlining maps, and they could look on the map and be like, okay, even though, you know, on this map, it says that the red district is the 4th grade, what that means is that that was a district populated by a lot of minority groups. And so this is how the Federal Housing Administration would then determine who could and could not receive a loan, basically. Another piece of this is that real estate brokers at the time had a code of ethics, and the code of ethics basically said, as real estate agents and brokers out there, we are going to make sure that we don't sell a house to someone who's white in a Black community and vice versa. So they also helped perpetuate segregation. And then the VA also adopted the same kind of rules and policies as the Federal Housing Administration and had the same effect of excluding minorities from loans.
Could I ask real quickly, this is Commissioner Goldfarb, what year is this Denver map that you're showing us?
Ooh, I will have to look into that and get back to you.
Or time frame?
Like early 1900s.
So yeah,
like
I think maybe like the 1930s. Yeah,
yep.
You'll see that.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So Angel, if you click one more time, when you click on different areas on the map, it would come up with kind of clarifying remarks. And so I'll just give everyone a minute to read this one. This is one of the red districts. And so this is just kind of the maps that would truly inform planning and decision-making, and I think it's important history to know. Commissioner Libby posted in the chat a link to this map. So it's 1938.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. Another way that exclusionary zoning was perpetuated was through the idea of the single family communities. And there's a lot to this piece, but Hoover was president of this organization called Better Homes in America. And this organization promoted single family home ownership and put out pamphlets and newsletters that perpetuated this idea that apartments were undesirable because of ignorant racial habits of Blacks and European immigrants who were in those apartment buildings. And this is kind of part of a broader scheme of single family home ownership, where single family was kind of an ideal of a white middle class. So a stereotypical, you know, man, woman, and a couple of children. And it excluded a lot of what different racial groups would consider family, and therefore they couldn't get single family homes. Another thing is single family homes were more expensive than apartments and multifamily homes because, right, there's property on it, it's a larger plot of land. And as I talked about before, the Federal Housing Administration, the VA, there were no loans to be insured for Blacks generally. And so they couldn't even get into different communities that had single family homes. Not to mention many of these built out communities were also insured and backed by the federal government and the FHA. So they had different covenants and restrictions in the communities that stated Blacks could not move into them. And as a result of that, not only could different minorities not get into these homes because they didn't have the money and couldn't get loans, but also those single family communities were just not even allowing different minority groups. An interesting Supreme Court case here is Euclid v. Ambler in 1926, which addressed the issue of the constitutionality of prohibiting apartment buildings in single family neighborhoods. And in this case, really the underlying reason for prohibiting the apartment buildings was because the people didn't want minority groups who lived in the apartment buildings to go into the single family neighborhood. So there was a racial reason underlying the prohibition, but the Supreme Court said it was constitutional to prohibit apartment buildings in single family neighborhoods as part of zoning and planning in the local community. But in the majority of opinion, it stated, the judge stated that an apartment is a mere parasite that detracts from the safety of streets and the residential character of the neighborhood is destroyed. So I think it's really important to understand this idea of when people say, oh, it's going to, you know, destroy the residential character of a neighborhood, really understanding what that means and the origins of that, and trying to dive deeper than, you know, oh, just let's protect residential character of a neighborhood. But
this is Commissioner Gargano. I have a question, and maybe this is, but maybe we should add that when we talk about preserving the character of our neighborhoods, I think we should be really clear about what that means to us.
Yeah.
Because that is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it's really hard to, you know, people don't seem to feel like it hurts their neighborhood if it's a large house, single family home.
Right, exactly.
But if we had clear guidelines on what that means to us as a community, it would be really helpful.
Right. It's a good thing to keep in mind. Yeah, so we can dive deeper than just the surface level phrases. Yeah. And so this is a map of Boulder County. And so multifamily housing is only allowed in the transitional zoning district, multifamily district, and a little bit in the Niwot rural community district. And so Boulder County is a lot bigger than this, right? But these are the only places where multifamily housing is allowed in the county. So I think that that's important to recognize. And as we'll talk about a bit later in this presentation from other people, it's just important to note that a lot of this is along the Diagonal Highway or 36, this transitional zoning district at the edge of Boulder, and things like that. So important to keep in mind there.
I think our current plan does that on purpose, yes?
Likely. I mean, I wasn't here when the plan was in place, right? But yeah, yep. Part of the conversation. So next slide, please. Thanks. So other factors that were at play is private restrictive covenants. So those are like the Wondervu restrictions that Kathy talked about earlier. But intimidation is also an important factor in segregation. So this is a photo from Denver. And if you click one more time, this is some information closer home in Boulder County. And there were, as you know, late as the 70s and 80s in Boulder County, there were signs in stores that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed. And so intimidation like this can also work to facilitate segregation and is important to keep in mind. Next slide. Another thing that we have sort of touched on in this presentation is the process that's involved in a lot of planning and zoning decisions. So the public hearing requirements bring in a lot of what is termed neighborhood defenders or not in my backyard folks. And while neighbors with all viewpoints are welcome to participate, studies have shown that more often than not, the people who do participate in public hearings have overwhelmingly negative views of new housing, more so than the broader community does, and are socioeconomically advantaged in many ways. And so this is something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So as an example to kind of talk about from very, very recent history, and I know that this was a very controversial decision, but I kind of wanted to put a racial equity lens on this decision, is the Twin Lakes subdivision. So this map on the right-hand side shows two parcels of land that were in Area 2. And Area 2 is in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan as an area that's intended for annexation into a city because it has urban services that are readily available. Diversity of housing types and costs is a huge concern in Boulder County, and that's only growing. And this site in particular is a good place for infill development. As you can see, it's surrounded by residential communities, a little bit of business/commercial. And so Boulder County Housing Authority and the Boulder Valley School District came in because this property in Area 2 was designated as low density residential and public land use, but they wanted it to be upzoned effectively to medium density residential so that they could build some affordable housing. And staff recommended the change in designation because it was good infill development, and housing cost and housing stock in Boulder County is something that is a constant and growing concern. So we go to the next slide. So the first thing to think about with this, this case study, I guess, is that it required a 4-body review. So it required the Boulder County Planning Commission, Boulder County Board of County Commissioners, City of Boulder Planning Commission, and the City Council in order to change the zoning on this. And like we talked about with public hearings, only certain people have the time and ability and knowledge to attend these hearings. And so when you have 4 of them, it just like quadruples the barrier to entry and the number of voices that are actually heard. So here I've kind of listed out some of the comments that supported denying this change. And some of these here are that the proposal to develop the 2 parcels as low-income housing will irreparably change the character of our neighborhood. Build something that really fits, make everyone happy. I'm not opposed to low-income housing, but I urge you to find other more suitable space for building. My very peace of mind and quality of life are at stake here. The owls were there first and have a right to stay where they are now. I would prefer no development on these 2 fields, but the density is a big problem because of the negative impact, traffic, noise, quality of life. The grass is green even without rains, and so wildlife activity use this corridor, so protect it for the wildlife. These are kind of the 2 biggest groupings of comments that came in. One was to protect the open space and wildlife, and the other is neighborhood character and traffic density, quality of life. Yeah, so if we can go to the next slide. So ultimately that proposal got denied. And I think it's important to understand and think about why it got denied and what lenses people were looking through when they made those decisions. So one way to combat exclusionary zoning is a term called inclusionary zoning. And that's where there's planning ordinances that require new construction, portion of that to be affordable to low and moderate incomes. City of Boulder has some inclusionary zoning practices. Boulder County does not. So should we? Another thing that really is highlighted from the Twin Lakes decision is how can we make preservation of open lands, space, and rural character compatible with increasing racial equity in zoning practices? And so how do we make sure that we're not just saying we need to protect open space and rural character and we need to protect our neighborhood character? How do we make sure that we're not just using those things to exclude different types of housing and different groups of people? When we're talking about protecting neighborhood character, we need to be careful about thinking whose neighborhood are we protecting? And one thing that I think is really important in terms of the idea of multifamily housing, particularly with the backdrop that single family housing came about as a exclusionary zoning practice and to segregate communities. Propaganda went along with that to state that multifamily housing was not as safe. It brought different types of people there who were dangerous to others, and that type of propaganda and information that was spread early on, I think has lasting impacts today, both in the number of areas zoned single family versus multifamily, and how even today we think about single family versus multifamily housing areas. And it's important to think about whether or not these decisions have been viewed through a racial equity lens. And if we deny multifamily housing in places where it's been contemplated since the 1970s, like the Twin Lakes area, if we can't build multifamily housing there, where are we going to build it as a community? And if we don't build any of it, are we leading to disparate impacts on racial minorities and socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals? So these are hard questions. It's a hard topic, but I think that it's not just something that's happened way in the past. It's something that I think can continue and does continue to happen in our present. And so it's important to really look at these decisions that have been made through a racial equity lens to help keep improving in the future. And with that, these are kind of just questions to consider as we go forward, but I'm going to turn it to Dyan to talk a little bit more about an exclusionary zoning practice in mobile homes.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'm Dyan Harden. I am code compliance in community planning and permitting. So our next topic concerns how Boulder County's mobile home communities fit into this discussion of race, equity, and inclusion. And I'm going to speak briefly about the broad history of mobile home communities, and then Rachel Arndt from Public Health is going to speak more specifically to the issues of inequality as it relates to mobile home communities in Boulder County. So to start in time, just before the invention of the automobiles, travelers generally stayed in hotels located near train stations. But with mass production of autos and increased mobility, in the 19-teens and 1920s, travelers were able to venture independently farther away from towns. And the less wealthy could camp out in tents, and the wealthier began to acquire luxurious custom-built trailers. And some of the earliest trailer parks were actually developed to accommodate and attract wealthy customers with these upscale sleeping and travel trailers. Next slide, please. With the stock market crash in the 1929 and the Great Depression in the 30s, people lost homes and farms and jobs. And some people packed up all of their worldly possessions and, packed them into little humble trailers and traveled the country trying to find better opportunities. So during the Depression era, trailer settlements that housed poor traveling workers began to pop up. And as they became more permanent in nature, exclusionary zoning ordinances also began to pop up, disallowing permanent habitation in trailers or restricting trailers to less desirable locations. There was a resurgence in the status of mobile homes in the 1940s when the US government needed wartime housing, and they bought 500,000 trailers and mobile homes, which was the entire industry capacity at the time, and moved them to military bases for housing. And then after the war, mobile homes were moved into college towns for housing under the GI Bill. Some of the earliest civilian mobile home communities grew up in or around college towns. And it's important to acknowledge here that these housing benefits went almost exclusively to white Americans. African Americans were systematically excluded from many of the GI Bill and housing benefits at the time. Specific to Boulder County, a 1944 Boulder County zoning allowed trailers in licensed trailer camps or as housing for domestic servants or employees. Next slide, please. So for a brief time in the 1950s, mobile home park inhabitants actually had higher incomes and educational levels than the US population at large. But when students under the GI Bill graduated from college and got jobs and started reaping the benefits of the investments that the government had made in them, there was a movement of this mostly white population away from mobile home parks and toward the single family house suburbs. It was also in the 1950s that we started. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. It was also in the 1950s that we started differentiating between mobile homes and trailers. The 8-foot width limit for travel on highways for trailers was overcome when people started pulling them with trucks with CDL licenses and permits. And over time, as trailers were used more as permanent homes, mobile homes started getting wider. You know, up to 18 feet in width today for a single wide mobile home. Mobile homes are now defined as from the period when they started being built greater than 8 feet in width up to 1976. Post 1976, they're called manufactured homes. That's when Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, started to require that all mobile homes be built under HUD inspection and carry a HUD seal off the assembly line. And specific to Boulder County, in 1968, there was a change in zoning that impacted mobile home residents. Previously, mobile homes had been allowed in the multiple family zoning districts, but beginning in 1968, they were restricted to multiple family suburban zoning districts. And approaching closer to today, we have the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, Policy 7.08, which addresses the importance of the preservation and development of manufactured housing as a important affordable housing option. And in 1985, this cutting edge mobile home park zoning district was established, which is another important protection that helps prevent mobile homes being redeveloped for other uses and losing that source of affordable housing. Next slide, please. So this map comes from the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service. It was designed in 2013 and uses 2010 census data. Each dot represents one individual color-coded by race. And I borrowed this concept of overlaying some of our mobile home parks onto this map from Crystal Launder from the City of Boulder Housing Division. So we can think in terms of race and demographics and why that matters. If you look at the two mobile home parks I included here on the south of this map, Table Mesa and Sans Souci, those are predominantly white populations, but they skew pretty heavily towards senior citizens. And then some of our other mobile home communities have pretty high Latinx communities. Next slide. So why does race matter in mobile home parks? If you think in terms of how people accumulate wealth over time and over generations, traditional homeowners own both the land and the home located on the land and can generally expect the value of their home and land to appreciate over time. It's kind of what was addressed in the House Where We Live In video. Mobile home owners, on the other hand, rent the land where their mobile home is housed. The mobile home is actually considered chattel. They own only the mobile home, which depreciates over time. So compounded to that is the fact that Latinx, African American, and Asian families acquire a greater proportion of their wealth from their homeowner equity. And so they are disproportionately impacted by these intersections of race and zoning. In fact, homeowners equity is the largest single component of wealth for Black and Latinx families. And it accounts for almost half of Black and Latinx wealth versus a third for Asians and a quarter for whites. And with that, I'm going to turn to Rachel to continue the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Diane. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And just wanted to reintroduce myself, Rachel Arndt. She, her, hers. I'm the Built Environment and Healthy Eating Active Living Coordinator for Boulder County Public Health, and wanted to thank my colleagues in the Community Planning and Permitting Department for allowing me to participate in this presentation today. So what are mobile homes and how do they contribute to a family's ability to generate wealth? Diane just did a really good job summarizing that, but the terminology around this industry can be somewhat confusing. So as Dyan described, individual and mobile homes can be owned by individual residents or families, but the land upon which these homes sits is owned by one mobile home park community owner. And also important to note is that the homes themselves are not actually mobile. They either cannot be moved due to their age or potentially could be moved, but at a very large expense to the homeowners. Equally challenging, vacancy rates in mobile home parks are extremely low in Colorado and throughout the nation, leaving owners with very few options if they have to move or sell their home. While there are some mom and pop mobile home parks, many small independent parks are being purchased by national conglomerates or hedge funds, and that includes the map, Sans Souci, the park that was on the map that Diane just shared. The lack of mobility of tenants, specifically their inability to move their home, is attractive to these mobile home park investors, these hedge funds, because the residents literally cannot move their home and the owners have a captive audience. Additionally, this bifurcated ownership model creates challenges. Rising land prices, like we see in Boulder County, cause unpredictable and often unaffordable increases in monthly lot rents for residents on low incomes. The lack of mobility that I already talked about poses challenges. We're very fortunate here in Boulder County that we do have manufactured housing zoning, but in other places, municipalities, even within Boulder County, that can cause resident displacement and rapid redevelopment. Mobile home park owners defer maintenance on the water and sewer infrastructure, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. We have examples of overcharging of water and other utilities, which leads to residents being priced out of their homes. And the lack of secondary water standard enforcement results in unpalatable drinking water, specifically for one park within Boulder County. I also wanted to note that in Colorado, there are over 900 mobile home or manufactured housing parks that house 100,000 residents. And in Boulder County alone, including the municipalities, we have over 3,700 mobile homes within 38 mobile home parks. So we do have a lot of residents, and mobile homes are often touted as the largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing in the country. Next slide, please. In addition to challenges resulting from this split ownership model, manufactured housing parks face many challenges due to their historic siting and lack of maintenance by park owners. You can see on this slide here, the Sans Souci Mobile Home Park is highlighted on the right. So many manufactured housing parks are located in floodplains and vulnerable to severe weather events. So specifically, some of you may recall that in 2013, the Riverbend Manufactured Housing Park in Lyons was completely destroyed by the floods, and over 4 dozen homes were lost and not replaced. In addition, deferred maintenance results in old water and sewer infrastructure, which is susceptible to breaking. So the The clip of a Daily Camera article, I believe on the left, is from the Orchard Grove Manufactured Housing Park in February of 2019. The water was turned off for over 7 days. I believe it may have been even 9 days due to old infrastructure freezing, breaking, refreezing, breaking in the winter months during a very cold spell. Poor source water, which could also lead to unpalatable drinking water or inadequate water supply in some areas of the county. Aging home infrastructure also does contribute to poor water quality. Sometimes residents don't have the funding to replace that themselves. We also see in some parks a lack of physical access to parks and open spaces and a lack of sidewalks to connect folks to other uses that are nearby. And because the infrastructure in the park, like roads, are maintained by the park management, these oftentimes are also not repaired. Next slide, please. The health and equity challenges outlined in the previous slide do matter, because when residents advocate for more favorable conditions or improvements in their parks, they are often met with retaliation from park owners. In 2018, actually, residents from the city of Boulder and Boulder County, manufactured housing residents, I should add, submitted an application to the Department of Regulatory Agencies to ask them to conduct a sunrise review and determine if manufactured housing owners, the park owners, needed to be regulated in order to help rein in some of these inequities. The department found that clearly harm is occurring in manufactured housing communities. Those instances of harm largely stem from the lack of enforcement of existing laws, bad actors exploiting a relatively loose regulatory structure, and the inevitable tension that arises when the house belongs to one person, but the land beneath it belongs to someone else. Some of the examples of unfair treatment manufactured housing residents are listed on this slide and outlined in the report. So parks adopting unlawful rules and regulations. An example in the San Souci Park would be making it illegal for children, or a violation of a rule and regulation for children to play in the streets. And just to provide a little bit of context, in previous law, if a park resident were to violate rules and regulations multiple times, they could actually be evicted from the park. And as I stated earlier, it's impossible to move and challenging to even sell a home sometimes. So that is a big issue. Predatory towing at the expense of the residents has happened, even in parks in Boulder County. Non-uniform fees or retaliatory billing for complaints. I have personally seen a water bill upwards of $1,000 a month that escalated from $25 to a few hundred to almost $1,000 after a resident complained. Threats of eviction, which can be really challenging for communities of color that have language barriers. Land use and building code enforcement has been used in some parks to selectively penalize certain residents if they are squeaky wheels. And then also trespassing on homeowners' property and harassing homeowners, especially those without good English language skills. And the sale of a park without notice, which is required in law. Ed? I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because actually a lot of great work has happened in the last couple of years. And I wanted to thank the Planning Commission specifically and the Community Planning and Permitting Department for their support of protective policies in the public health element and the housing and economic element in the comp plan. In addition, in 2019 and 2020, Boulder County Public Health, the City of Boulder, and actually manufactured housing residents, as well as several other partners, played a huge role in the drafting and advocacy for legislation. House Bill 1309 created a dispute resolution and enforcement program through the Department of Local Affairs and their housing division, which finally provides residents with an agency to investigate, mediate, and also enforce against violations of the existing state law. This law also provided local control for counties, authorizing them to enact ordinances to protect manufactured housing residents' rights. So we're hoping that we can make some progress in this area. House Bill 201196 was a rewrite essentially of the mobile home park bill, legislation from the mid-'80s that had not been updated since it was adopted. And this legislation was really key because it addressed resident priorities. We worked with residents across the state to make sure that we were addressing their most critical needs. And that includes retaliation, making that against the law, arbitrary eviction, so trying to create some consistency between manufactured homeowners and also traditional single family homeowners. So those rules and regulations violations would no longer be grounds enough for eviction. Creating utility billing transparency for residents, which was not a requirement of the Public Utilities Commission beforehand. Landlord responsibilities in terms of their maintenance on in parks, and also establishing a right to privacy, which has been a big change. As we all know, owning the land is just as important as owning the home, and House Bill 1201 created an opportunity to purchase. So this bill provides mobile home park owners, the residents of mobile home parks, with an opportunity to purchase their home. So it creates an administrative process to provide time for residents to purchase their own park. And in Colorado, we're lucky enough to have a resident-owned communities organization to do so. And I look forward to talking more about these pieces of legislation and further progress that we can make at a future date with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm Angel Bond. I'm the Mobility for All Program Manager for CPMP, Community Planning and Permitting. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation. Before I really get into the history of transportation, I just want to acknowledge that transportation and land use are really dynamically linked. We find that the reason why we're focusing on affordable living is because affordable housing should be 30% of somebody's income, and affordable transportation should be 15% of somebody's income. But as people drive to qualify for a cheaper rent or a cheaper home, people really start absorbing some of those increased transportation costs that we don't necessarily acknowledge. So this map here is what's called a housing plus transportation cost index. And what it shows is for a regional moderate income in Boulder County, which that definition here is $56,000, almost $57,000 for a household of 2.45 people. People are spending about 54% of their income on housing plus transportation. And that is just for people who are in that regional moderate income. People who are low income or lower than that, they're really spending a lot more on housing and transportation, and we're seeing increased numbers of people who are really housing and transportation burdened. So really, I want to say that transportation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It really is connecting people to places that they want to go and that they need to go. I'm going to walk you through just what's called a travel shed here. And I've taken Vista Village Mobile Home Park as our example. And what I want you to understand in this exercise is that really transportation access equals access to opportunity. If people don't have a way to get places, to jobs, to schooling, to healthcare, then they don't have as many opportunities and access as everybody else. I really want us to look through transportation access through this racial equity lens. And for quite a while, for about 70 years now, racial inequality has really impacted our transportation investment choices. And really, transportation is a pillar of economic opportunity that really allows people that social mobility. So your physical mobility is really directly linked to what jobs and potential growth you have. So this is the mobile home park, we're going to go through first a 20-minute walk shed. So I'm using walkscore.com for this, and this is the area that people can reach, the opportunities that people can reach from the mobile home park by walking 20 minutes. This is the area of Boulder that people can reach riding a bike 20 minutes. So you see here, it's getting us a little bit farther over here to Broadway in the central Boulder economic district. So people could easily get a job over here within 20-minute bike commute. This is our transit shed. So right here, this is much more limited. And what this is assuming is that people will walk a half a mile from the transit stop. And finally, this is the car. So you see that somebody who lives at Vista Village, if they had a car, they would have access to jobs and opportunities in Longmont, Broomfield, Louisville, Superior. This is not by accident. This is a result of years and years of investing in the personal auto as a primary mode of transportation. It's not by chance that the civil rights movement really started with transportation. Actually, even the term separate but equal has its roots in transportation. So the Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 really solidified that term separate but equal. And that at its heart was basically about separated trains for people of color and white people. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a reenactment of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat for a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. This act of defiance really led to the Montgomery bus boycotts that kick-started changes to transportation laws and equal rights on riding public transit. In the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the 1961 Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were a group of civil rights activists. Riders were a group of civil rights activists that wanted to travel on Greyhound buses, interstate buses from DC to New Orleans to really challenge the Southern states' segregation laws. And here in this particular case, you will see a group of white people met the activists in Alabama, and they firebombed the bus because this was directly in contrast to what the local laws were. And within this, throughout this entire presentation, there are going to be links that you can watch videos, listen to podcasts, read articles. So we definitely want this to just be a starting point in our learning process. So the segregation of America really could not have been done without the interstate system. While the interstate system was a very ambitious infrastructure project that really fostered that interstate commerce, it also was billions of dollars that was used to segregate a nation without regards to the communities that it demolished. Here you see a map from 1958, and it really is showing what the interstate highway system would look like. What happened was the locations where we chose to build the interstate system really solidified that Jim Crow era segregation and the discriminatory patterns of settlements in different communities. Where we chose to demolish neighborhoods really was linked to race and class. A lot of planners used and engineers used the idea of clearing slums in order to justify moving the interstate system into their area as a way of like cleaning up a neighborhood. What we wanted to also say is that this interstate system really did subsidize the white flight from integrated communities in the urban centers to suburbanized areas. And the federal government really subsidized it. In 1944, the federal government would pay for about 50% of any of the interstate highway projects. In 1956, that amount was increased to 90%. So the federal government was essentially subsidizing white flight. I really love this image because I think it shows a stark contrast between the America that we wanted to be and the America that we were at the time and are to some extent now. Really, the car has become a symbol of American prosperity and suburbanization. Here, this picture is called American Way of Life, and it was taken right after a flood in Louisville, Kentucky in 1937. And in front of a white family in a car, there is a line of African American people waiting to get food from a distribution point. So that symbol that really was pushed about the car being equal to, or the car symbolizing the prosperity of America during the Cold War and after World War II, really highlights and exacerbates the inequality and racial injustice in our communities. Prior to this really strong marketing campaign, streets were open to people. You had pedestrians, as Rachel was talking about kids playing in the street. That was very common in the early 1900s. People would be in the streets, they would walk to the streetcars to catch the streetcars. And really it was a concerted marketing campaign to really talk about how streets are for cars only, and it's for efficiency and moving people in their personalized auto as quickly as possible. This is an example of a streetcar system that existed in Denver in 1917. So here, this is a really great picture. You have a pedestrian, you have a streetcar, you have a bicyclist, you have cars. And this streetcar system really was pretty extensive. And you can see that the streets here in Denver were not necessarily just for cars. This was not a thoroughfare to try to get to move people as quickly as possible. There were businesses along this route, and there were people in the street. And this really, the pushback to this was really for the efficiency of moving cars through the streets. And that is a lasting legacy that we're dealing with say, Vision Zero goals, and just protecting the health and well-being of people who are using other modes of transportation. In Denver, the first segment of I-25, they started planning it in about 1944. And we have here a map from the Valley Highway Plan. And this was really a limited access highway that they wanted to build in Denver. And they really looked at different areas of Denver. The most direct route for I-25 would have been along Colorado Avenue. Here in the legend, it's kind of hard to see because it's all the same color. Along this area, you have high-value residential districts. And in a second, I will go to the next slide where we talk about the redlining that Jasmine was showing you earlier. But they eliminated Colorado Avenue as an option for I-25, the first segment of I-25, because of how much it would cost to build it through this high quality area, and then also because of the relatively high character of the area. Instead, they chose a less direct route along the Platte River because it was low value residential districts. It was the location of a lot of people of color, immigrant communities, and also some industrial districts. This is a map of the redlining just to compare. Again, Colorado Avenue here is surrounded by the best, the green, and the still desirable locations, and some definitely declining areas. But you can see along the Platte River where ultimately we end up with I-25. That was primarily surrounded by hazardous redlining communities. This leads to environmental justice issues that we're dealing with still today. You look at Globeville and Elaria Swansea, and they're really at the intersection of I-25 and I-70. And in order to construct these highways, they had to really break up some of these properties and use eminent domain. And they've really bisected a lot of these communities, and it's led to lasting impacts of poor air quality. Elaria Swansea is the most polluted zip code in the entire US. They also have increased noise pollution due to trucks roaring through the community. They also have limited connectivity. They're not able to walk to the other side of their neighborhoods. Also, they don't have a lot of sidewalks. There's only one separated bike lane. And really, it has resulted in them being physically isolated, especially if they don't have a personal auto. There's also limited grocery stores and parks in these communities as well. So if the interstate system and the highways really encouraged people to move out to the suburbs, what really solidified the dominance of the car is the suburban street design. The reason why is because the suburban street design really ensures that the only practical mode of transportation in a lot of suburban communities is the personal car. So you look here, this is from a design guide from the Federal Housing Administration in 1938. And this was the typical street grid that was a standard street design prior to the 30s. This is a desired good street design. This has much more limited connectivity. You don't have people driving through your neighborhood. You don't have people traveling through your neighborhood. There's really only 3 ways in and out of this community. And there's not really the most direct route that people can walk or bike or take transit. Here we have an example of pretty much maximum connectivity. And when I say connectivity, I mean that there are multiple options to go the shortest distance. And when I use the term mobility, what that really means is how easily people are able to move through their community. So this particular street design, which was deemed bad when we were starting to develop the suburbs, that is actually much more conducive to other modes of transportation because people don't have to drive the longest distance to get out of their community. The result of this, the impacts of designing for cars, I'm going to take a local example here. This is in Gun Barrel, and this is Heatherwood Elementary School in the right-hand side here. And this is just a midpoint by the golf course. And as the crow flies, this is probably less than a mile from this house to the school. But since there is no direct connection, there is no connectivity, it ends up being about 3.1 miles to ride a bike or walk to the school, this direction, or 2.2 miles. And what this really is saying is that any children who are in this area probably aren't going to be able to walk or bike to school. Just for reference, the Safe Routes to School Partnership says that for elementary school students, it's appropriate for them to walk up to a mile to go to school, and for high school students, 1.5 miles. So really, this area is pretty much only designed for the car. You can't get effective transit in this area. It's not efficient to walk or bike. So getting a little bit more into street design, we're going to talk about transit a little bit more. What we've done, and the reason why I want to talk about this is because in Boulder County, what we've seen is a lot of lower income households are being pushed out of Boulder County because of the lack of affordable housing. And they're being pushed to more suburban areas that don't have a street design that is conducive to efficient and effective transit service. So this linear road design here is what we need to have maximum ridership and to make transit really effective. You can see an example here when you have multiple destinations along a straight line. The bus doesn't have to weave in and out of traffic. It doesn't have to turn. People can easily get off and go to these destinations by walking. But when you have a street design like this, the transit service that you have for this type of scenario isn't necessarily going to be as productive, quote unquote, because the bus has to turn off and go into little cul-de-sac areas, and you have to have a certain turn radius for a bus to be able to turn around here. So what we're seeing more recently, and it'll still be seen like what the effects of COVID will be on this, but what we're seeing is that previously with people of color being in urban centers and low-income communities being in urban centers, it was more of a street grid, older design that really worked well for transit, and transit was a viable option. But what we've currently seen is really a swap where the more desirable communities for people to move into, wealthier, whiter people to move into, have been in those urban centers, which leaves some of the suburban areas where the location for the lower income housing. In that scenario, we are pushing low-income households out to a suburban design that is not conducive to transit, where we're pretty much forcing them to purchase a car. So this car-oriented land use and development really equates to dependency on cars. And the reason why this is a problem is because it requires longer trip lengths, higher energy consumption. There's also more traffic congestion. there's also higher transportation costs. And here on the right-hand side, I have a true cost of car ownership graphic that really talks about how owning a car really costs a household $8,000 to $10,000 a year. But the reason why I put this up is because typically what people think of is how much gas they put in their car, maybe how much insurance they pay, but they don't think about necessarily how much they're going to pay in registration fees. They don't think about repairs. They don't think about maintenance. They don't think about depreciation. And all of those costs, if low-income households are not saving for that, those will come all of a sudden when they have an emergency car repair that they need to get fixed. The reason why this is a big issue is because it puts the burden of car ownership on the shoulders of people of color and low incomes to have access to more opportunities. Currently in the US, our auto loan debt is $1 trillion. And that's compared to our student loan debt, which is $1.5 trillion. So really, a lot of economists believe that we may be in a subprime bubble when it comes to cars, because the car industry is also lengthening the amount of time that people have to pay back those loans to 7 years. Typically, the industry standard was 5 years. And by that time, if a low-income household was able to pay off a car, if they had perhaps some funds in reserve to be able to fix any repairs. But when that payment is 7 years, that's beyond the point where you're going to have to start doing more repairs, and people are going to be saddled with extra loans and extra costs for their car. The reason why this auto loan industry is so problematic when it comes to racial equity is because there's extreme discrimination in lending practices. And it's been well documented that Blacks and Hispanic borrowers pay $300 to $500 more for a loan on a car than white borrowers. And higher interest rates in general are levied on people of color than white people. So really what we want to talk about is, what is the best use of our space? This may be a classic, this is a kind of redo of a classic graphic that we have here about how much space, public roads are needed to transport the same amount of people. Here, this much space is used to transport all of these people by bus. This much space is used or is needed to transport as many people by bike. And when you have cars and autonomous vehicles, even electric vehicles, it takes up the same amount of space. So really what I want to show with this graphic is that having a personal car and relying on personal cars is really space inefficient. It really doesn't allow us to get the most out of our infrastructure, and it really isn't as equitable a transportation system as what it could be. One of the problems in our public perception of transportation options is we think of transit as a social service and not necessarily a part of a resilient transportation ecosystem that allows us to maximize our infrastructure. And that personal auto being considered to be like your primary mode really has a strong bias for the public process when we're talking about what projects we're going to approve and which projects we pay attention to. There has been a long documented history of opposition to transit. And a lot of this was after the reintegration of transit, after the Montgomery bus boycotts, a lot of white people were fleeing to the suburbs and using a car, and they really started associating the bus with people of color and lower income households. So there's a phenomenon that's called end of the line. And what it really is the suburban cities opposing any transit being extended to their communities. In the link, this Free to Ride documentary, it really focuses on the first Title VI civil rights case where a suburban community opposed a bus coming into their community. And they used some of those coded racist language, like bringing in poor people, crime, poverty. And really, in the case of this video, it really was synonymous with their racist beliefs and around who was riding the bus. Here locally, we have had a situation where local local people have opposed the extension of a bus line, an RTD bus line. In Louisville, RTD was looking to extend the 228 bus to Kestrel, which is an affordable housing site that Boulder County Housing Authority opened up a couple years ago. And it had always been planned in the development of that community that there would be a bus to extend to that community. And once RTD actually put it on its service changes, there was extreme opposition. The first public meeting, there were two people who were able to show up from the Kestrel community, but the public meeting was held in a neighboring community. So it was, the housing authority site is located in Louisville, and the public meeting was held in Lafayette. And it was held at a time where people who depended on transit wouldn't be able to get there and get back in time for the end of the meeting. So at this meeting, we had about 20 people who really opposed the extension of the bus through their community because they didn't feel like it was the right character. They didn't feel like it was an appropriate service for their single family home location. We were able to actively engage with the housing authority residents to be able to get their perspectives in writing and present to the RTD Board of Directors. But it just shows that when it comes to transportation access, we really do think of transit as something that somebody else uses, not something that white middle class people are using. So another thing that I want to talk about is the power dynamic, because when we're talking about transportation projects and what gets funded, there really is disproportionate power. As we had talked about earlier, oftentimes low-income households, people of color, have really busy lives that are complicated. It's really hard to make time to go to public meetings, but our current system really sets up this bias towards people who are able to show up and speak loudly. So in that scenario, drivers of cars typically have higher incomes and more time to be able to go into a public meeting. And transit riders may not have the time. They may not have the transit service that would facilitate them going to a public meeting. That cost of inadequately investing in our transit system has really resulted in deepening inequality and forcing people to purchase a car just to have access to opportunities. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disparities in rail versus bus. And I know that this may be a challenging topic just because of our current situation with Northwest Rail. And I don't want it to be, I don't want it to necessarily be about that. This is more about the surrounding land use. So this link here, racism has shaped public transit and is riddled with inequities. It'll be in the handout that we send to you. But this is really a case study that it shows two transit corridors. The Southern Transit Corridor here is light rail, and the Colfax bus corridor is bus in traffic. So a lot of times people will say that they support transit and that they support rail because there's that reliability and dependability, and rail doesn't necessarily have to fight with traffic. But one thing that I want to note is that it's not just a binary. It's not bus or rail having like reliable transit service. What we've talked about generally is framing transit as choice riders versus dependent riders. And I find that this is a really problematic term when we're talking about transportation planning, because choice riders are typically considered to be white, more affluent rail riders. Dependent riders are considered to be lower income, people of color, and bus riders. And I really want to challenge this assumption and this terming of dependent riders, because as we've seen during COVID, really the dependent riders are our essential workers, and they are people who are continuing to ride transit to keep our community moving and going. This dynamic really has some racist undertones, and it really props up some of the preconceived notions of what is quality transit and what isn't. So in these two cases, the Colfax corridor, the ridership of this corridor is approximately 52% white. So that means that it's 48% people of color. Also, it has 22,000 riders per day, which is pretty impressive. There are 125 people within a half-mile walking distance to this route. So, if you look at this, this is probably one of the busiest routes that RTD has. If you look down here for the EFR light rail, this one is 73% white. It has 8,000 riders per day, and it only has 9,932 people within a half mile. So this juxtaposition is really stark. When you have 22,000 riders per day versus 8,000 riders per day, you would think that RTD would invest in this corridor. But what we see with the difference between rail and bus in transit is that rail has a bunch of amenities, right? It has a parking lot, a park and ride that's associated with it. It has covered shelters. It has trash cans. But along the Colfax corridor, there are many bus stops that don't even have benches, don't have trash cans. And so really what RTD is saying by this distinction here, or by what we're saying as taxpayers by this distinction here, is that the people here are going to ride no matter what. We don't have to provide them amenities. But the people along rail lines, they have to be incentivized to be able to ride transit. So nationally speaking, rail riders tend to be whiter and higher income, and bus riders tend to be more likely to be people of color and low income. And really this stigma of the bus versus rail doesn't have to be the case, because if Colfax had a dedicated lane for the bus, it could be just as fast, it could be just as frequent. And really when we're looking at what attracts ridership, it's not necessarily the shiny stations, it's about frequency. Because if people miss one bus or one train, they have to know that they can catch another one in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. If you have hour service on a train every hour or every half hour, if you miss one bus, you're stuck at that station for about 30 minutes to an hour. So really, instead of looking at this, this binary of rail versus bus, I just urge us from a racial equity standpoint to look at the service quality and what is needed to really have an like a competitive alternative to the personal auto. So moving on to what we subsidize. So on the previous slide, I did talk about just the different capital costs, how much it costs to have I did talk about how it's more expensive to have a train station. But here I'm going to talk about the operating costs. So this is looking at how much RTD, this is from their 2019 service performances. Basically, the commuter rail is being subsidized at $16 plus per boarding. Light rail is being subsidized at $7.50 per boarding, and the bus is being subsidized around $5 per boarding. So in addition to the increased capital costs, there's also a huge disparity in how much the commuter rail riders and the light rail riders are being subsidized. And on top of this, there's also inequities in fares. And since this is the beginning of our conversation, we will get into a little bit more of fare equity, but generally speaking, white working class professionals are more likely to have access to eco passes and things that make transit much more affordable, whereas low income households don't have the same access to those discount fares. So all of this also requires, all of this car dominant infrastructure also requires parking. So we have minimum parking standards in place that require new developers to build X number of parking spots depending on the zoning area. And what I want to challenge us to think about is really, if we want to talk about affordable living and parking, we can't necessarily we can't forget about parking, because all of this infrastructure to support the personal auto comes at a cost, that opportunity cost. This same area to store 2 vehicles in a parking spot could be used to create a 2-bedroom apartment. And also, when we look at who does not have a vehicle, we can see that there's racial disparities in who does and does not have a vehicle. So just a comparison, white, about 2.8% of white people on the American Community Survey responded saying they don't have a vehicle, and 9.5% of African Americans said that they do not have a vehicle. There's some great links down at the bottom that will go into a little bit more about the high cost of free parking, but we need to ask ourselves, is it worth having free parking in a lot of our communities? I know there's paid parking in part of Boulder County, but the abundance of paid free parking is pretty obvious. But is it equitable to have free parking when we can't have affordable housing with multimodal transportation access? So just kind of taking you through a journey of history here. We're going to take the Daniels and Fisher Tower. This is Denver in 1922. And you can see that there was mixed use development and the tower is standing. In 1976, really a lot of those buildings were leveled in order to make space for parking and make space for those for the people living in the suburbs who are white and commuting to work in downtown Denver. And then we take a look at what we have today, which it's kind of revitalized a little bit as far as being a little bit more balanced. There probably is tons of parking here and parking garages, which is really expensive. But you'll see here all of the bus stops, transit stops around this area. And it's also located right along a pedestrian mall, the 16th Street Mall. So this is showing us, this is pretty much the same trajectory that we as a society have gone on, you know, valuing more of that multimodal land use to pretty much solely focusing on the personal auto, and then kind of going back to hopefully more multimodal connections. So on that, I will stop with a question, but here on the right, there is just a quick snapshot of how much the federal government has spent on transportation since 1956. And just to show you, 78% of that has been on highways, 10% of that has been on mass transit, 1% has been on rail, 9% aviation, and 2% on water transportation. So really, at this point, I just want to pause and ask you all, what do you think equitable investment in transportation options would look like in Boulder County if we really looked at it through a race equity lens?
I mean, this is Commissioner Gargano. It sounds like we're subsidizing people that have money for cars to give them parking, or we could be putting that money elsewhere. You know, we always think, oh, okay, well, we have to have parking because people might park in the neighborhoods, or we have to have parking because people need to get there. Sometimes it feels very like chicken or the egg. Well, if they can't get there with the car, maybe the bus will get ridden and then we can have the bus go more often.
Thank you.
I think this is Gavin McMillan. I think also equity might look like, and I really do appreciate the land use transportation connection, but and it just made me think more about this whole big picture. But I think we need to figure out how to put the types of housing that people can afford near an investment in the types of transit that they'll use. And I can't separate those two issues. I've never been able to. I think they're hand in glove. And I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you. But I just think that those two things, whenever we talk about transportation, whenever we talk about housing and affordability, and as it relates to equity, as your slide demonstrated, someone spending, more than half their budget on transportation is not an equitable way to plan our community. And we need to think about those things together. So that's what it brought to mind for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
This is Commissioner Bloomfield. You know, I feel like all of this stuff is super intertwining. To what Commissioner Gargano said, you know, just when we look at parking, we get pushback from the neighborhood, and you know, people think that the parking on their street is somehow their right, not a public resource, and so you know, we have a hearing, and people from the neighborhood show up and say, well, people can't park in our neighborhood, and that's just kind of more of this entrenched, you know, property owners want to keep the character of their neighborhood, and like, what does all of that mean? I think it's all really intertwined. One question that comes up real quick is if there's ever been any studies doing like a survey, an opinion survey about, let's say, a particular project in a neighborhood or amongst impacted communities, and then looking at what the actual public comment at a typical city council hearing or county meeting, like it'd be super fascinating to see, like, because I know from personal experience, when we've had something that's been super intense with a ton of public comment, especially in one direction, and then I happen to talk to someone who lives in an area that's impacted, and they're like, yeah, no, I totally disagree with what all of those people that showed up were saying.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure about a study, but I can talk about anecdotally the example I gave with the 228 bus extension. We were able to get 2 people to attend that public meeting for RTD that was held in Lafayette, and they had to take an accessible cab. One of them had to take an accessible cab because the bus didn't operate on the reverse trip. And she spoke, and she really felt almost embarrassed, she said. So when that case went to the board of directors at RTD, I reached out to her again, seeing if she wanted to go to downtown Denver. I would go with her to be able to like support her speaking at the board of directors meeting. And she refused because she said that she felt attacked at the first meeting in Lafayette. And just anecdotally, when people are vulnerable and they don't feel like the system works for them, it's just really hard to get them to think that there's a place for them at the public meeting. So I think that we'll talk about that a little bit more with Alberto's presentation. So.
Well, and I'm hopeful that what Dale mentioned about having some different formats for public comment will really kind of open a lot of that up as well.
Yeah.
One of the resources that we'll get you is called Neighborhood Defenders, and it's a book, and it has a study that they did as part of that of who speaks at hearings and what are the outcomes of those hearings, and really looks at how affordable housing projects did not come to fruition because of who was coming to talk and what those outcomes were. So I'm trying to figure out how to upload that document to Zoom right now so that you have it, but we'll get it to you today. So.
Do we have any other comments or questions on transportation equity?
This is Commissioner Neske. I just have one quick comment that this sort of reminded me of was the APA conference in Colorado last year, and they were talking about data-driven planning and the amount that we invest in building highways that go out to the suburbs, and the amount of infrastructure costs that really are going away from our downtowns and maybe the people that really need those investments the most. So it just sort of reminds me that we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how and where we're planning and the amount where our money is going and the services that we're supporting and the people that it's reaching and providing for. So it just sort of tied that in for me for the data-driven planning.
Yeah, that's great. I would also add to that, just because I attended the Rocky Mountain Land Institute session on transportation equity a couple weeks ago, And really, I think that we need to look holistically at transportation, right? Because currently they do equity analyses at RTD, or they do them like when they're building a highway. But what is missing really is that that holistic transportation network and looking at like the disparate investments based on like where you live, right? So like the gut reaction is that the suburbs are probably like overly benefiting from, you know, the highway system. And if we also like the transit system, if we take that into account, like what does that do? I guess we just need to ask that question, like what does that do when we look at that funding holistically? Okay. So if there's no more comments or questions, I will go ahead and turn it over to Alberto.
Thank you, Angel. So as we dive into community engagement, I want to first start with Arnstein's ladder of participation, which is the item that you see on the right. And as we go over the history of the United States in regards to engagement and just activism, I want you to constantly look and remember, where do the people fall in this ladder? And there's a quote, also part of Arnstein's paper, that says, I participate, you participate, we all participate, but they profit. So it comes down to explain that many times citizens have honest intentions in participating, in providing their input, and expecting and hoping that the benefits that the government seeks to provide them will actually be on behalf of their opinions. However, that does not always seem to be the case. Next slide, please. So the International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2, provides a spectrum of what can be considered as public participation. So as you quickly gloss over these different types of participation, we as government officials, we as planners, we can look at what is the goal, we can look at what we're promising to the public and how we can achieve these promises. So it can be often said that, at least in the bare minimum, we inform individuals of the decisions that we're doing through planning processes, whether it is a public notice, whether it is a public hearing. By consulting, we can say that we want to hear their input, yet we can choose not to include it if it does not fit what professionals find adequate. When we involve people, we have things like workshops and polling when we make database decisions based on the public. When we collaborate, we look at people for advice and innovation to think outside the boxes of those that are currently making the decisions. And this can be citizen advisory committees, or we can build consensus through participation. And lastly, if we really want people to have a hand and to be fully civically engaged, we can empower them by placing the final decision-making power into these communities. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview of some of the landmarks that occurred over the past 70 years in the United States, starting with after World War II and the very beginnings of civil rights, where most of the population did not really have a say in how decisions were made, and only white men of power really ruled what transpired in government and beyond. So next slide, please. So in the 1950s, as Angel mentioned before, one of the big cases was Rosa Parks, which led to the Browder versus Gale case, which determined that segregation in buses was unconstitutional, but also there was a lot of violence in the country, especially against people of color. Brown versus Board of Education also ruled that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. And this led to the very beginning of the civil rights, led by Martin Luther King, among many other leaders across the entire United States. Next slide. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement continued to gain momentum, such as the Freedom Riders, which boycotted the buses by riding. And also you had the March to Washington, where over 250,000 individuals attended Martin Luther King's famous speech of "I Have a Dream." There was also an overall shift in general consensus due to widespread attention in the civil rights movement, which challenged the status quo notions of white people in regards to what it meant to be an individual of color. Among other news, the Stonewall movement started in 1959 with Marsha P. Johnson, known as a very symbolic trans Black woman, to have started the riots to advocate for the rights of LGBTQIA+. And this is also when in 1964, the Civil Rights Act enabled the Title VI, which ultimately prohibited in many ways discriminations on the basis of race, gender, class, religion for any of the protected classes. Next slide, please. As we continue in history, in the 70s, we come down to anti-war efforts for the Vietnam War. And also the women's right movement gains a lot of steam by advocating for equality and also for the right of them to speak up and to be active members of society without being undermined by the decisions of men. But this is also one of the first times in which we get attention to what it means to protect the environment. And so in 1970, we had the first Earth Day in the United States. Another picture that I want to mention in the center is the National Chicano Moratorium Committee, in which many Latinx community folks advocated for social justice for the Latino community, for they were also highly susceptible and were experiencing a lot of deaths in the Vietnam War without proper recognition. Next slide, please. In the 1980s, the EPA for the first time rules an increase in public role as part of environmental programs, which meant that they established guidelines that were essentially requiring any agency to provide public participation as a minimum. Women's rights continue with pro-choice activism and other benefits such as birth control and the right to have equal pay. This is also a time for the LGBT community to really advocate and be outside, to spoke for the mass deaths of people dying of HIV and AIDS. And lastly, in the center, we see Black students in the University of Wisconsin protesting against fraternities that continue to practice racist activities such as reenactments of lynching. Next slide. This is a summary of some notable legislation that kind of set the foundation at the national level for making bottom line engagement and going above and beyond. So starting with the Administrative Procedures Act, it established that minimum standards of participation, such as rulemaking, it needed to have at least public notice and for there to be a group representation for people that are outside of agencies, such as the general public. And then we go into several of the policies that the EPA enacted that provided citizens with the opportunity to serve in councils, and also that public participation was required in states that implemented these programs. Next slide. Another case study that I want to highlight is Jane Jacobs in the city of New York. So with Greenwich Village, Robert Moses, the city planner of the time, wanted to implement and bulldoze what is considered the east side of New York to build a highway. However, this comes to show down that not always the expertise of people in power is really what the constituents really agree with. And so the history goes that Jane Jacobs constantly debated Robert Moses and ultimately led to the organization of communities to advocate for homes, to advocate for spaces where people could actually live instead of being bulldozed by large highways, which led to many other complications, as Angel explained in her presentation, such as pollution, social and economic separation for minorities as well. Next slide. So as we stand in the present now, I would like to invite you to think about these items when you consider what is good community engagement. And when we center equity in community engagement, we really need to shift the baselines of what is the bare minimum. Are we just notifying people and expecting them to go above and beyond? Are we providing them with the right resources to act and to speak up? And this was mentioned earlier in your discussion. How are we really getting a hold of the people that really need to be on the table? How do we get a diversity of opinions and experiences based on people's identities? And when we center race in equitable engagement, we also need to be intersectional. And by intersectional, not only we consider race as a factor, but we consider things like age, gender, disability, sexual orientation, their rent or ownership status of households, their income, their educational level, and their language. All these things really shape up how you manifest yourself in society and how society manifests upon you. Going to communities is also very important because it really shows the picture of the living spaces instead of expecting people to come to establishments such as the city's hall. History matters. As I mentioned before, there's a long history for minority groups being oppressed, for them being disregarded throughout history. And so it is important to be sensitive, to understand why there is distrust, to understand why things might not be as easy for them to participate. Flexibility is also a really important virtue. When we need to adapt, when we listen to people, when we look to be proactive and to include people and to empower them, we need to make sure that we have the tools and the capacity to shift the process as it is. And to establish accountability in the last, but not least, because this will ultimately lead to relationships. This is what really builds trust. When you come into these communities, you should not just leave after your project is done. Make sure that you're there, you foster these relationships, that your name is known, so that you can regain that trust that was lost over many generations ago. Next, please. These are some examples that I want to quickly gloss over, and hopefully we get to talk about these at a later stage. But ask yourself, who is in power and whose voices are we missing? How do we get them back to the table? So throughout the country, there have been several efforts, both in transportation, housing, and other elements within the planning realm, to really go above and beyond to shift the baseline of what is considered equitable engagement. So when we look at communities, especially minorities, we expect them to participate for free. But Vision Zero in Los Angeles really started reinventing the wheel and providing people the virtue of making them as community experts, because ultimately there is value in the knowledge that they possess. And if you do not know how to approach a community, you will not get authentic data and you will not get authentic participation. Next slide, please. A local example that we have is a transportation master plan for Boulder County. And the efforts to make sure that this planning effort was very inclusive included to create a steering committee that put the voices in the table of many people of different backgrounds, different physical abilities, and also different socioeconomic status. And through this process, many people advertise partnerships through social media, word of mouth, and other outlets to make sure that everyone was included, not just the people that have access to internet. It also worked with community partners to ensure that trust was built and to also make sure that there was access to people who often have distrust for community, for government agencies. So such as the churches, disability rights organizations, senior centers, all of these people have had a role as part of the planning effort. Community surveys were conducted and community conversations were really important because it really allowed for people to be in a safe space where they could share what their experience was like in the transportation realm, in addition of coming together for solutions that were considered. Next slide, please. Another way to build accountability and build trust is to be inventive and to be creative in the ways in which we go to communities. Many cities across the entire United States are doing what is called City Hall on the go. So Boston, Dallas, and Durham in North Carolina have built trucks that provide several government officials the chance of going into more isolated neighborhoods and providing services such as being able to pay a bill, looking up for fines or any other records, and enabling those intentional interactions with people that might not often have the chance of going to government centers. I understand that this might not be the same case due to COVID, but normally we can really go above and beyond to be intentional in how we connect with communities and serve those that need it most. Next slide, please. Lastly, I just want to quickly gloss over the blueprint about equitable engagement in Durham, North Carolina. So when we think of planning, we can really be intentional in being equitable from the very beginning in this thinking stages all the way to the implementation. And we can have systems of accountability that look into who is being able to participate, how we're supporting people in the participation process, and how do we hold ourselves accountable as government officials when we make decisions. And there are resources in this slide that you can check out for more information. Next slide, please. So as we part ways, I would like to leave you with the following questions. What are the standard practices for community engagement in Boulder County? Any comments? Any ideas?
This is Commissioner Bloomfield. I'll just say it seems like I know that, you know, when staff puts out something for engagement, it seems like there's, you know, I think there's newspaper ads and then posting on the website, and maybe there's an email list. And I'll also say that I'm often not reached by any of those. Certainly, I think there's a big challenge of trying to engage different communities, especially given the fact that there is no longer, you know, sort of standard media that everyone kind of taps into.
This is Commissioner Gargano. Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that I rarely see anything. You know, if it weren't for the emails I get as a commissioner, I'm not sure I would know what we're going to talk about today. You know, meeting to meeting. I do know how to find that information, but it's not stuff that I would find organically on my own. And so I do think a lot of people don't realize things are coming up that may affect them. You know, when I used to do this work back in the day, and it was just always so hard, right? Beyond knocking on doors and going to see them physically, which to your point, Alberto, is not the same now as it was before COVID. And then even then you were only getting a hold of the people who had the addresses, right? And were in the space that you assumed affected them. But to the example of Twin Lakes, we were talking about bringing teachers in to live there who were probably living all over the county or even out in Broomfield or Erie or wherever else. And so if we were to even just canvass that neighborhood, you're not getting the people who would get the opportunity to live there notified at that point, right? Yeah, it's such a difficult question.
This is Commissioner Hilton. I do think that when we do the comp plan updates, a lot of times I'm impressed by the amount of effort that goes into engaging the community for those updates and the outreach that's done to different types of you know, sub-communities and the different modes of communication. That level of effort, I think, is, you know, it's probably not possible when we start dealing with more granular issues or like particular docket items. But I have been impressed by what we're doing related to comp plans.
Well, thank you for all the comments that you shared so far. And that brings me to the next question. What can decision makers do to foster processes that are inclusive and center racial equity? So how can we be equitable when we establish these processes across the county?
This is Commissioner Gargano again. The new approach that Dale was talking about earlier really intrigues me. lengthening the process and providing that more personal response time or ability to engage without being in front of a bunch of your neighbors and feeling ostracized or feeling attacked, right? But getting the opportunity to show up however you need to, and maybe not within a tight time window, I think would make a very big difference. Certainly we take written comment now, but I think written comment can be intimidating to people as well. It's just not, it's not quite an equalizer. Yeah.
This Commissioner Bloomfield, I definitely agree with what you just said, Leishan. And it seems like there's something around like having, maybe we have a section of the county website of like, how do you engage? And you have some videos, especially with the new system of, you know, hey, you can actually give your comment, especially because it's going to be a big change, you know, have some videos on how you can give your comments and your input in a non-time and location dependent way. And then, you know, advertise that as like an ongoing campaign.
If I may ask, Commissioner, how do we get to the people that might have difficulties accessing internet services or are not as familiar with, you know, the county website, or, you know, have very limited access to internet overall?
This is Commissioner.
I'll just say real quick, I mean, I think an ongoing campaign, right, of advertising on, I don't know, on buses and in places where, you know, senior citizen centers maybe, where people like that might show up. And then, you know, I love the idea, you know, if we ever get to return to some sort of normalcy, of, you know, of having the mobile centers and whatnot. Yeah.
So Commissioner Fitch, I think in terms of the current practices, we definitely skew the participation toward notifying people who might be negatively affected. It's very hard, the Twin Lakes example, to contact and to mobilize and to get equal hearing from people who might benefit. Again, the simple disparities in the degree of organization. I mean, I think those problems are not easily overcome, particularly unless we recognize that there's a degree of bias in just who shows up. Isn't going to be a random sample of the county population. It's going to be a group that's really incentivized to be there, and typically, I do think it's very often people who feel like their property values are going to be threatened by something the county might do. So I think this comes up in lots of different ways. I'll just stop there. I have something to say later about affordable housing, in particular the size of how we go about making decisions about where affordable housing is going to be located. And there are lots of ways of thinking about how to integrate transportation planning and those kinds of questions. But I think it's also important to think about the size and dispersion of low-income housing. I think one of the things City of Boulder has done, no other place that I've ever lived was not residentially segregated by race. Some section of town, some portion of the city was clearly by history or by choice of homeowners there were minority sections, there were the university section, there was a white professional section. And Boulder, I think to a large degree has avoided that. There still is residential differentiation, but I think we have achieved a lot of, going back a number of city councils have made the decision that you put small housing developments all over town. And that gets really tough when you're putting them next to some high-end housing who don't want those people in their neighborhood. But I think there are lots of statistical studies now that talk about social mobility for minorities. And part of it is getting out of single race, single class neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Commissioner Bloomfield. An idea that I just had that I'll throw out there is like, I wonder if we could have like a different staff member than the one that's the primary staff member for any given project. If they could be like an unheard voices champion or something like that.
This is Commissioner Gargano. I just keep thinking about how some of the amazing nonprofits that we have in Boulder County, you know, and of course they may not have the resources to show up, but you know, if we had these elongated timelines, could we get on their, you know, the Boulder NAACP, right? Could we get on their docket and they could talk about it and just give feedback through their meetings that they have? Or could, you know, EFA send an email to, or contact, however they contact their people, could they forward that information of what we're about to talk about and how it might affect them? You know, that may be a lot to ask for them, of them, because of they're limited on their resources, but there's just so many amazing groups and sub-communities that if we had just like a list, if we could click a button and get a hold of all of them and let them do the groundwork, it might have a big impact.
This is Commissioner Neske. One thought that I had that I know that City of Longmont does for accessory dwelling units is really trying to foster a sense of communication between neighbors, as opposed to going through the planner or getting to the final stage when you say you get to the Planning Commission to make a decision of something. You get to hear the public comment, but you don't really get to hear the discussion between the neighbors and how they feel about it, how they can maybe influence design or different characteristics of the project before it gets to the decision-making stage. And I was really, I thought that that was a fantastic way to address that, notifying all the neighbors and encouraging them before it gets to a decision-making stage to have a discussion amongst themselves to see if the project can be more compatible with the neighborhood as a whole and incorporate different people's ideas into the design. So I guess maybe a way that decision makers can do that is to foster more of a communication. I know we have neighborhood meetings, but if there's some way that we can get more neighbors talking to each other, then as opposed to you know, us sitting up here and making the decisions and discussing. But yeah, the quick thought.
This is Commissioner Gargano again, and it's that you have to fight the apathy of people that maybe, you know, approve of something, but don't have the energy to fight for it, right? Because in the end, they're not really that strong one way or the other. But that probably makes up like a very large percentage of the people in a given neighborhood on a topic. We may hear from 20 that feel really strong, and then there might be 200 that are for it but not going to come out. You know, how do we hear from them? It's just such a difficult question.
Well, I certainly appreciate all the comments that have been provided so far, and this is definitely not something that can be fixed at the moment, but we can certainly start thinking about it. And we can begin by reflecting within ourselves and then seeing what power do we have and what capacity can we make changes and how do we begin including people. But I would like to bring it back to Dale for additional remarks. And I thank you all for your time and attention.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Batteries died on my other headset, so I had to switch. Well, thanks everybody for participating in this session. I think it's been enlightening for staff to go through the discussions, and hopefully it was useful for all of you. And we hope to make this session available on the website. So even carving out a recording of it so that people who weren't able to attend today can have access and can follow up on it. And what we really hope is that we can continue the discussion. So if there are things that you heard here today that sort of really tripped your interest, or ideas that you have for how we can move forward with discussions on certain topical areas, we'd love to hear that, because we understand, I've made a commitment to folks, to myself, that I'm not going to let the conversation drop, that we're going to keep coming back and having it, because that's the only way we're going to make change happen. And so we want to keep coming back to you with sessions like this. They won't be 3 hours long every time. We'll do them a little bit shorter and do them very targeted on a topic or two. But so I want to hear from you of what you think would be useful as far as following up. What people would you want to hear from in the community? What groups might you want to hear from that might help enlighten and change how we look at land use and transportation and programs in the county? And if you don't have an answer right now, you can always email us later too if we've worn you out. But
This is Commissioner Gargano. I just have a couple last thoughts. You know, one, I was thinking, I really wish I had some of this language and you know, during some of the dockets we've heard, like Twin Lakes in particular, I was really at a loss then. And hearing some of this stuff now, it's like, oh, if I'd had some of that at the front of my brain. And I don't know, certainly we don't want to, we're not trying to like bias those situations, but how do we make sure that we're, you know, maybe it is just writing it into our plan, again, to say, here's how we're defining character of neighborhood, and here's how we define equity, and here's how we are pushing for equity. And this child wants chocolate so bad. She's just, and anyway, how do we bring that? How do we make sure that's part of the discussion every time? Give me a second. And then the other part, I've totally lost, sorry. Me.
I don't know how that is at all.
So I want to, Commissioner Fitch, and I'd like to thank staff for a really well thought out presentation. It's really is thought provoking and lots more questions than we have answers. At least I don't have answers for what to do about a lot of the issues that are raised. But I think it's a very important discussion to be having.
Thank you, Commissioner Bloomfield. I'll definitely second that. And I also see a lot of opportunity, you know, as we address this. I feel like there's a lot of crossover with our environmental goals. You know, I think if we can, every time we're looking at one, we're looking at the other, I think there's a lot of benefit to that.
This is Commissioner Goldfarb. I really look forward to going through all these materials and spending some time thinking about these issues and trying to come back to you with some more thoughts on some of these things.
Commissioner McMillan, as a planner, I want to thank all of the planners and planning related fields that put this presentation together. I really think it's important for the planning community to kind of be at the forefront of this conversation. And I feel often that we're seeing, and I say we because I'm a planner, as kind of like administrators of rules and regulations. But I think, you know, what you're all doing in your department, it's really important to be visible and informing and educating folks. And I was listening to this presentation today, and I learned a ton. I'm actually going to apply for a AICP credit for it. You guys will help me out with that. But what I was thinking, you know, I've seen a lot of this material in different iterations and versions and presentations. And I don't think that like a lot of the community gets to hear what we just heard today. And it's really informative. And so, you know, in line with kind of being at the front of this conversation, I'd love to see ways, whether it's putting it on YouTube and letting people look at it when they can, or just finding ways to get this information in front of the larger community, so then they can be part of the conversation that right now we're trying to include them in, and trying to figure out ways to do it. So as we've all documented, it is really difficult to get people to participate. It's just hard. I know there's no tried and true method to it. And I just think we need to be proactive and do things that we've never done before, you know? We can send letters, and maybe the code requires us to send letters to neighboring properties and all that stuff. But I just think, you know, do something different, totally different. Let's, you know, go to where people are and ask them how they, what they think and how they can participate. And then I'll just sum up by saying, but thanks. That was a great 3 hours, in my opinion. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Neske. I wanted to reiterate that as well. It was a lot of information, and I know that's a lot of work going into that to present it. And I know you're all very great about getting us this information, because I know I definitely want to send it out to my coworkers and make sure that this is really at the forefront of what we're talking about, not just in planning, but across all of the different city departments, and making sure we get more people engaged and talking about this. And I would also recommend, if we could potentially, and for future discussions, get some of the instructors from the Pearl people engaged in raising leaders. They are really informative. They're in touch with, you know, the 1,000 different types of boards that we have in Boulder, Colorado. And I learned a lot from that program. So that might be a really good resource to tap into. We talked about, I remember we talked about Native American law in that as well. So that might be a really interesting thing to dive in as well. Thanks again.
Okay.
Dale, do you have anything else for us?
No, I appreciate all your interest in staying with us for the 3 hours. And I want to thank staff for working really hard at putting this all together. The staff that you saw present, as well as a number of other staff who were involved in all the discussions and helping prepare this. It was a lot of work that we all feel is worth it. And we look forward to continuing the discussions as we move forward. And I love the idea of trying to get this out in other ways to the community to involve them. We saw the opportunity to put it on this planning commission agenda because it was light. And so we didn't have all the materials quite where we wanted them to have by last week to send out ahead of time and get some other folks to be able to participate. But this was a good trial run, and we'll keep doing it. And I expect all of you as planning commissioners, as our citizen planners, to help spread the word and get these messages out too. So thank you.
Thank you. We all really appreciate all the work, obviously, that went into this. Really is thought-provoking. And hopefully we can take some of these thoughts and get some good action going on all this. So anything else from anyone? Is there a motion to adjourn then?
Commissioner Bloomfield, I move we adjourn.
A second?
Commissioner Neske, I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. We can all go have
Thanks,
chocolate
everybody.
now.
Yeah, we can all, I'll go find those chocolate bars.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.